go once everyone's in from outside. Okay. And as we wait, I'm sure some people who are here with their colleagues are likely sitting with their colleagues, but if at some point, maybe after our tea break, if you'd like to pop in another table and meet some other people, that might be nice. But I know that there was also a bit of chatting and networking outside. Yeah, as we slowly wait to start, I'll maybe just introduce myself. My name is Zugiswa Kota. I work at the Public Service Accountability Monitor, which is a member of the Imali Yethu Coalition for Open Budgets. And at today's session, my role is, to moderate the session and to make sure that we have a nice, interactive, engaging time, and that everyone whose voice wants to be heard, or as many people of us can be heard today. But before we get started, perhaps very quick housekeeping. I know everyone already knows where the tea is. Please feel free to continue to grab some tea, fruit as you wish. Outside in the lobby area. The loo is around the corner, out the door and around the corner, but there is someone, I think, still at the table who can direct you to the closest loos. And I do know that I'm sure the smokers by now have found their way to the appropriate place. So yeah, it's not to discriminate. I don't actually know where that area is, but I assume it would be outside. I'm not sure if there is a closer area. Yeah, I think that's the last housekeeping note, other than the fact that please do feel free. I know the venue is one of those more formal spaces, but I'd really like, as we begin, as we start, to emphasize the need to really feel that you can speak, that you can interact. The same goes for those of us who are online, who I assume can hear me right now. Great. Yes, thumbs up. So same goes for those online. We won't hear your voice, but we'll certainly like to get your questions and hear your views, and we'll bring them into the room as we can via our communication here. So hopefully you'll get a sense of the community there and the space in here as much as possible. Right. I think we're good to get going. I'm quite excited about today's session for various reasons. I hope I can get close to this without making disasters. Okay. Yeah, I think for various reasons, today's session for me is quite interesting. One of the biggest reasons is because of our really esteemed panel. I know that very often people say of the speakers they've managed to convene, we've got great speakers, esteemed speakers. I actually do really think that. It's not just to be polite. I think our session today is an exciting one. So good morning to everyone, and everyone who's here, who's chosen to join us. I'd like to particularly extend a welcome to those online, and to our speakers on behalf of the South African Health Technologies Advocacy Coalition, and as I've mentioned, the Imali Yethu Coalition for Open Budgets. We've called today's roundtable, and in fact, I think before I go that route, I will say a little bit of who we are and what we're about for those of us who've not heard of either of our coalitions. But we've titled today's roundtable A Reflection on Public Budgeting and Inclusive Governance, the Role of Policy, Oversight, and Activism. And so I'm especially excited that to guide us on this discussion on an issue of national significance, we feel is again this amazing panel of speakers who span a broad range of expertise across public finance, parliamentary oversight, activism, budget advocacy, policymaking, civic participation, as well as budget and fiscal policy reforms, amongst many others. I really do think we've brought together speakers who have a lot to say in really meaningful ways about the work they've done over the years. And it being the 30th of August, this point in the calendar is really a manic one as far as schedules are concerned. And so we'd especially like to thank everyone who's chosen to join us, who's chosen to take the time to be here, to speak to us, and to have an opportunity to share your inputs. Thank you sincerely. This time of year is a difficult one. We'd like to thank everyone who's joined in person. I know these days it is often easier to just join online, but I think convening in person is also quite meaningful. We look forward to hearing your views, and to those online as well, very eager to hear your reflections. The other aspect of it being so busy is that it does mean that some of our speakers may need to be in and out. Some of our speakers, in fact, aren't even in the country and are straddling different engagements, for which we're very grateful. So we'll adapt. We'll see how we go, and we'll be flexible as the need arises. But before we proceed, just really a little bit of background on this session and why it is we felt it was important to be here today. As you know, we really, all of us recognize that our country is one of a constitutional democracy with justiciable socio-economic rights. And these rights include access to health, access to housing and education. And the other aspect that we'd like to emphasize today and perhaps engage in is that some of the commitments our governments have made is around openness. One of the international platforms is the Open Government Partnership, of which South Africa is a founding country member. And within the OGP, there is this commitment around budget transparency, around open data more meaningfully, and participation, public participation in all its guises. And so it's really important that when we look at budgets and we talk about allocations, we were speaking earlier at our table that this notion of budgets and budgeting is one that can be very intimidating and exclusionary in a sense. And so a space like this for us, convening experts in the space, tackling this issue from different perspectives is really valuable. And really discussing how do we make public budgets more public? How do we make budgets more accessible? And so our coalitions, in a sense, are really trying to grapple with those questions, in addition to really interrogating issues of equity or questions of equity and progressive resourcing. And so we're faced, as we know, with really high levels of inequality in our country. And we feel as our joint coalitions and many others in the room who do this kind of work, that in order to tackle these issues, making sure that we have participation and meaningful engagement in the budget is quite important. So really to round off in terms of, again, the background to this session, we also recognize our shrinking economy. We recognize the real limitations sometimes, or the constraints around public finances, and that the engagements, the asks, very often civil society have massive asks within public finance, and those asks are, contained within a limited, envelope. And so when civil society groups are able to advocate more progressively and in these ways, to build their skills, to build their capacity, to collaborate with parliamentary groups, with Chapter 9 institutions, with the executive, we feel that those are really important opportunities for multi-stakeholder engagement in different ways. Of course, that's not easy. And so part of our conversation today is really to have a bit of a frank conversation about what are the ways that collaboration can meaningfully take us forward. And so our two coalitions have come together and identified, on the one hand, important players within the space, people with really key voices, key work, decision makers, policy makers. But we've also identified the opportunity to engage those for whom budgets are not central, but for whom the socio-economic aspects are central to their work, which I think is really important to bringing the two together. So what we hope to do with this roundtable, before I step back, is really to talk about, to some extent, these commitments in the OGP. We hope to really explore the possibility of further meaningful participation. The parliamentary space for many of us has been a meaningful one, but we want to take that step forward and talk about that somewhat. We want to talk about how to influence the work, to some extent, of the legislatures in the budgetary process. Can we do that as civic actors who are outside? Is it meaningful? Is it worth it? What kind of investment of time should we be making? And then really quite a specific aspect as well is that we want to try to bolster opportunities for engagement. Participation by ordinary members of the public, which is quite an ambitious thing, but is necessary. The Constitution promises this. But also to deepen our own capacity and knowledge as civic actors who are outside. Lastly, there's a very specific advocacy point around 2% allocation of health resource and innovation, which our SAHTAC colleagues are invested in. We'll maybe hear more about that later on towards the end. Very briefly about the organizers before I hand over to, I know, the people you actually came here to listen to. The South African Health Technologies Advocacy Coalition is an advocate for an enabling environment for research, development, and access to life-saving health technologies and innovations. The idea behind this work is to increase public awareness on the need for harmonized and improved medicines, regulatory research and development, or R&D, as well as to influence change through appropriate policy and budget mechanisms. So this issue of really recognizing the public finance space. And lastly, I think this is quite interesting from SAHTAC's perspective, is the activating political and social support for these changes and holding government accountable for their commitments to improving the health R&D landscape. So this issue of accountability is one that'll come up quite a lot, I think, in our conversations today. The second partner coalition, Imali Yethu, is a coalition of civil society organizations. It's an open coalition. I'd say our flagstone work has been around engaging the National Treasury, opening up budgets, the development of an open budget data tool, Vulekamali, which I would encourage people to visit. Our work is also inspired by the standards of co-creation and participation, which are envisioned in the OGP, of which, as I've mentioned, our country is a founding member. One thing we really want to sort of bolster in our work is to deepen public access to budgets, to deepen participation, with this notion that if more people are engaged in the budgetary space, there is a greater chance of deepening accountability and potentially really pushing this line around equity and access. And so that's who the two of us, or the two coalitions, are. We can talk a little bit further. Please feel free to ask more questions. Why do we do this work? Who are you? Who funds us? All of that is up for discussion. Please feel free to do that. Right. Quick look at our program today. What we have before us. I'm really just about to be quiet now. We're going to start off with our keynote from the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, followed by Dr. Kay Brown, who is from the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative. Then we'll open up for a bit of discussion, a bit of Q&A. I'd really, again, like to invite you to share your reflections in addition to questions, and really kind of create an interactive space rather than a sort of classroomy space, which we're wanting to avoid. After that, we're going to open up to one of our speakers who's joining us online, and Togo Matonko herself and Dr. Binny, who's on the floor and will both speak to us about issues, what they've learned in the context of budget advocacy. They've both really been warriors within the public finance and parliamentary space, particularly in the appropriations budgetary space, and so they've possibly got some really interesting reflections there. We'll then again open up for some engagement, an interactive Q&A, discussion, thoughts, reflections. Everyone in this room has, I know, a lot to contribute. We'll then come back. We have another online input from the Parliamentary Budget Office, Dr. Jantis. And again, we'll have a bit of a discussion. And then really at the end, we will ask whoever of our speakers, and hopefully the majority will still be with us, to join us on the panel again, to really just have a really open conversation, in part around, okay, so what? For me, very often it is important to ask and then. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that at the end of our session, before our call to action, which my colleague will take us through at the very end of our morning. So that's what it looks like. Is anyone unhappy with that? Anyone feeling like they'd like to walk out right now? No. Okay, we're still together, which is fantastic. So in our programs, we do have our speaker bios for our panel, for anyone who's interested. And know that in the age of Google, we can do further, we can have a look. But I would like to just briefly introduce each of our speakers before they take to the podium. Our keynote address, as I've mentioned, will be from the Honourable Legislator, who is the Deputy Speaker of Parliament. And as I think many of us certainly will recognize, I think many of our parliamentary figures, given that I think when we talk about access, it's been really important to have access, visual access, YouTube access to Parliament, which I think has been really fantastic. Honourable Tsanoli this is his second term as the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, and having been re-elected as the Deputy Speaker in the 6th Parliament in 2019. He has more than 25 years as a public representative, which is great because part of our reflection today is around, since, in 1994, we're approaching 30 years essentially of these promises around progressive budgeting, around equity, around building a society for all that through public resources. So I think your career, Dr. Imali, is quite meaningful in terms of its span in that regard, and we hope to really hear from you some of those reflections. This experience includes both roles as a public representative, as well as in the legislative sector and the executive. I found it very interesting that Honorable Tenali is the founding national deputy president and also has been the president of the South African National Civics Organization. And so I think a really rich background there, and I'm destroying the mic, I'm sorry. Without further ado, we're going to open the floor and I think really receive very warmly Honorable Tenali to the podium. Thank you. Well, hold on to it. Okay.
I was invited because I made some remarks somewhere. And these remarks were published, and this is why I'm here. I'll start there and then weave myself around many areas I want to touch on, just briefly. Maybe to suggest that next month, in October, not next month, South Africa is hosting what's called SAHTAC, the public accounts committees from the region. So earlier this month, they were around South Africa to come and check our state of readiness. So our South African Public Accounts Committee hosted this visiting forward team from the regional team who came to check on us whether we are ready to accept them. And it was during an address to that session, which was held in Durban, that I remarked that I would like to encourage and speak on behalf of the members of this Public Accounts Committee to be returned to Parliament and to the legislatures broadly after the elections, that it serves a good purpose when experienced people are able to be returned to carry out this important work. That experience is crucial to what they are able to do confidently without being scared by who's in front of them. Continuity is necessary for that reason. But the other reason is that, of course, we must have changes. We do expect there to be changes for democratic purposes, otherwise we wouldn't be democratic. And this is why I argue that, in fact, our resolution where I come from, say 60% of members should be old members, meaning experienced members who are returning to their portfolios and so on in many instances. But sometimes shifts happens there. This subject is crucial because as a member of parliament, not only inside our own parliament, but in the country, we have sought to act together as the Speakers Forum, the entire legislative sector. So we meet every quarter as the Speakers Forum, chaired by the chairperson of the National Council of Provinces and the Speaker of the National Assembly, with speakers and deputy speakers from each of the provinces to discuss issues that are common to us. So we've got, I chair the capacity building and gender subcommittee of the Speakers Forum. There are others who chair the lawmaking, and there are others who chair the financing and so on, public participation, so that we learn from each other's experiences of oversight and accountability in the entire legislative sector, and to look at what improvements are possible and should be emerging. But we also learn from being members of the SAHTAC Parliamentary Forum and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, in which some of these things are discussed. I remember a book from the CPA in which they brought members of public accounts committees in the Commonwealth, and as a result of that discussion produced a book that says something like following every rand of the public sector and where it's spent and so on. So telling the experiences of public accounts committees to carry out their functions effectively. We, as the Speakers Forum, planned what we call an accountability summit, in which we sought to invite a variety of people. One of those people we sought to invite is someone called Caroline Lukens-Meyer. She has written a book called Bringing Citizens to the Table, in which she talks about her experiences of working at the local, at the provincial and national in the United States, but also now working as a civil society organization outside of there, providing guidance to members of the public, broadly speaking, but also to officials inside the state to appreciate the importance of engaging the public in issues that confronts them at every time, to ease effective contributions. In her book, she talks about experiences of practically doing this. For example, budgets and budget-related issues can be complex. So what they do, she says an interesting example in Denmark, where they have a body that invites people to break down the complexities of subjects in which they want to provide input effectively, and was thinking about how that is a very important capacity building initiative in any community, so that people are not intimidated by the supposed complexity of a matter as if they can make contributions to those issues. So this is one of the areas that we wanted to draw lessons from in looking at our own situation. And this is why I think it's a very important part of the system. I was interviewed by UWC some time back, and they asked me, what would I have done differently? And I said that we would have liked to be more out there talking like I'm doing here now, but to describe the system as we have evolved over time. Let me speak in my other capacities as well. For example, now that we've just recently passed the NHI, or are about to do so, it goes through the NA, we passed it there, an NCOP through which it must go and so on. In 1991, I just tracked down and found an article I wrote on the role of civics in primary healthcare. And when I read it, it sounds very relevant even today because of the elements that it raises for effectiveness. I also say it because I want to suggest that reference to the civics, as the program director mentioned, but also the UDF 40. I speak in all my capacities, ma'am. It's a good experience to reflect on the things we did deliberately to contribute towards policy and what should be done once we have government in our hands. And one of those things was the Reconstruction and Development Program. But also, once we did that, once we entered government, I was phoned by Raymond Satner from Shell House then, who said, "You are wanted in Parliament." To do what? He said, "No, don't ask those questions. You're wanted down there in Cape Town." Anyway, I went there, but I subsequently came back because of what I assumed was a mistake, when it was actually a mistake by myself not understanding the changes in the list that head offices have over our membership there. But I returned later the same year. And I'm citing this, that understanding the processes is very crucial. When I reflect on our successes in what we did, not just firstly in the slogan from the head office of Sango that we worked with was demanding genuine democratic governance. This word genuine arose from the fact that we were aware of very bad so-called public participation activities that involve people being called, spoken to, and then they respond, and the next thing that happens, they go and do what they wanted to do anyway. Very weak forms of public participation. So when we meant we want genuine democratic governance, it was because we would be treated properly, that the ideas that we express would be taken on board in what emerges as implementation programs. That this is what was originally planned, this is how we impacted on what emerges should emerge from governance. And if that does not happen, then there's a source for conflict, as it used to be before. So those practices, in speaking about the former General Secretary of the National Civic Organization, I pointed out that some of the things we were very successful in doing is not only ensuring in the objects of local government, for example, when you read those 5 objects of local government, they are so easy, they are literally on your tongue, but they speak to the agenda for sustainable service delivery, for having people having a say in the management and running of local affairs in a very explicit manner, in the manner in which any civil organization can articulate in very understandable language. Not only did we say that of the objects of local government, but also in legislation that would emerge, we demanded that it must have public participation, involvement. Now, this is where it is crucial we talk about continuity and change. When you don't understand that your responsibility in your area of governance requires of you to engage the people in the decisions you take and how you should do that. In other words, including, of course, the quality of induction of those who get into these portfolios. This is what we are now obviously confronting regularly. I chair the South African Parliamentary Institute, which is a capacity building initiative for lifting the capacity of MPs and MPLs so that they are able to effectively run the committees they participate in, and they understand the legislative requirements for public engagement, because that makes a huge difference to sort of the work we do. This applies to the budgets themselves. In other words, that the allocation of budgets and how it happens, it is often the view that we do not sufficiently suggest that there are timelines within which you should understand the budget process, both at the national level. After the SONA is the budget, which is presumed to speak to the SONA and is intended to be implemented effectively. Now, those allocations, the basis on which they were made was as a result of the budget committee, which is a committee of cabinet of the executive that says, on basis of what we understand the problems are in the human settlement environment, in the environmental protection and regeneration activities of the state, broadly speaking, currently this is what allocations we're able to make based on our priorities. And so when we understand that, that there's a budget committee that does that work. When it does that work, it's an important part of what we should be communicating to you as people with interest in influencing the outcome of those discussions and the allocation, the nature, content, and quality of the allocations that are done to make the most impactful use of public resources. I think looking at the allocations to local government, for example, although from inside local government, people argue that, look, we are relatively underfunded. I think the budget office, the FFC, the Finance and Fiscal Commission itself would argue the same way, that we are underfunding local government. But one of the key issues about it is the effectiveness of use of the already allocated public resources to municipalities. And secondly, over time, the quantum of allocation to local government has been growing. The graph shows an upward mobility of contribution to local government. And one of the former World Bank advisors says to me one day, gave me a lift, he says, you don't know how glad you guys decided to collapse the previous individual grants to local municipalities into a single municipal infrastructure grant, a component on which the people must decide where that money is allocated to. By the people, he meant at a municipal level where it matters most. The councillors there and the officials there must make the appropriate allocation from resources coming from the national fiscals. Maybe I should also say that when we campaign for local government at the beginning, we used to argue for what we called one city, one tax base. And then once we got into government, we realized that this is not going to happen. No amount of collection of taxes inside a municipal boundary, so to speak, would be adequate to address the backlogs. And that you needed one country, one tax base. So that Mom Florence Mkize from Lamontville, veteran of women's struggles, said to me one day, because we were campaigning against demarcation of Lamontville and Hambanati into KwaZulu-Natal, KwaZulu homeland. She says to me, Lichisa Mtanam, what can we do with bananas and sugarcane in KZN without the diamond and gold in the mines in the Free State? Because it was already, this idea of one country, one tax base was very alert for her, as far as she was concerned, that the distribution of resources must be across the entirety of our country. Others should not benefit because they don't have these resources being extracted in their areas and so on. That's one perspective that we learned growing up. The public participation involved requirements that sometimes we are often found wanting on are explicit in legislation and in the requirements, firstly of the executive itself. If it wants to introduce a piece of legislation, they must provide, at least to cabinet, a socio-economic justification for that legislation. But principally the political reasons behind the introduction of legislation, so that you don't use legislative measures to solve political problems. There's a consciousness about that matter, is that we, in designing and in understanding the open spaces for contributions, I think our biggest problem is not whether we are sufficiently transparent or not, but it's the responsiveness of the inputs that are made during those open sessions and how they are taken on board, being incorporated in what needs to happen. But we were discussing earlier on outside here that dialogue in its nature means that some of your ideas are going to completely embraced or amended or completely rejected. That must not be a source of collapse of any kind. That's the nature of dialogue. We can even think of us as Lucan's mayor says that government is a stakeholder. So other players are equally stakeholders whose input is valuable. But the mandate has been given to government to implement in certain instances. Of course, there are cases where some of the implementation can happen outside of government. There's no, in fact, this is one of the requirements of strong participation, that it must include running our own budget, coming from the state, an institution that produces what the community wants. We created a multimedia center in Lamontville called Johnny McCartini Media Center. And a friend of mine, a comrade, was connected to a very excellent board of directors, people from the community who were professionals, but the municipality completely refused on the grounds that the municipal management legislation prevented them from doing so. They have to ask for a tender for that program to be run. And unfortunately, it ended up in that way, in that the municipality itself let it shoot out the tender, got a professional team to come and run the organization. Now, these are some of the clauses in legislation, both in the public finance and the municipal finance legislation that needs to be looked at and critically revised to provide for effective allocations to community-based development initiative of whatever kind, that it must not be so strictly confined only to be done by the state itself, because the level of scrutiny and oversight of those institutions must be as tough as they would be even if it's under the state. That such mechanisms are what we need more of than what we do have today. When they do happen, it's as a result of people's struggles to insist that these resources are ours, we must run them so that we can direct them to appropriate places and so on. Because priorities, show me your budget, you'll see your priorities. The statement goes. The Standing Committee on Finance at the beginning in 1994, Jill Marcus headed the initiative for gender budgeting responsive initiative. Unfortunately, under political pressure, that initiative collapsed. We've been working at it systematically over that long period of time to try and lobby for its return. Because, for example, when Madam Speaker Baleka Mbete, we sent a gender specialist to Namibia, to the SAHTAC Parliamentary Forum, to help with gender responsive budgeting systems. She successfully did that, and the publication was sent to all member parliaments of SAHTAC so that we must all do it, but it's been worse than the pace of a village cow. It's not understood fully. So officials say they hear, and the next thing, you don't see it here anywhere. So our effective oversight of such initiative, for example, should have been what was done a long time ago. It was found to be the most appropriate thing. We sent it around to others who accepted it as well. Globally now, we are champions, not only of gender budgeting and responsiveness, but also we are suggesting that information that you produce, departments, we tell them, what's wrong? What's the difficulty of disaggregating this so that you reflect who you're impacting on? Because this is what is doable. It can be done. So this is the challenge of implementing what I refer to as a responsive and sensitive budgeting allocations and so on. So we are hoping that those who will come back with more energy, I'm not alone here from Parliament. Fiscal, who chairs, and he warned me, I often made the mistake of thinking expropriation. That he chairs appropriations. So I tell him, yeah, no, you know, it's because of my bias for land as well. Yeah, with which he doesn't fight. I thought I should provide that. Let me just summarize in a few words the diamond. I think just show it there. It'll be in a minute and a half or so. The diamond that I have here is the problem that we confront as chairpersons of committees, but also as leaders in institutions, that we are unable to handle responses to our leadership. So at the top of that button, hear that. Can you guys put up that diamond that he gave me? Yeah, sorry, man. I know technology is absorbing you now. I'm finishing, I'm done, almost. Yes. This diamond comes from a work called Dialogue, the art of thinking together. So if this fellow, William Isaac, studied African governance, Mahot, in Kund, and how people conducted their affairs in there, and distilled it into what he calls the tension and synthesis of opposites. When you provide leadership, as you have done in this instance, for example, there are people who are going to follow you, but follow you because it's you who initiated this thing, not anybody else. And others follow you on reasoned grounds that this is why I'm supporting this initiative. So in that way, your fellowship is positive if you reason it out in the way I'm suggesting. And then there will be those who oppose, okay, your proposals. But they will do so also positively in that they want to correct what's there, okay? Because perhaps the leadership you are pointing to is defective in some way. And secondly, there might be negative completely. In the extreme, they throw a grenade on your head. That's extreme opposition, bad news and so on. So in us both, and then there's a bystander perspective on the left of the diamond, which means that someone provides a perspective that I haven't heard you talk about the weather on the day you are planning this event on, and what you do to mitigate its effect on what we're trying to do. And in that sense, it provides a perspective, something you may have missed of that sort. On the other hand, it can be a view that simply represents ongoing thinking about things that you can frankly do without. So they become paralysis of thinking instead of taking action. So each of those nodes on the diamond constitute what are archetypes, leadership archetypes. You can do it individually in preparation or as a team to think about yourself and the role you play in your organization, in your unit, in your team. Are you always following whatever is said and in a positive manner or in a negative manner? So it's a self-evaluation tool. You can use it for that reason. And others can take it deliberately, being the devil's advocate. I said that to a meeting of local government discussing the regional electricity distribution when I chaired COGTA. Someone who was part of that meeting meets other people, tells them, this man said he wants to be a devil's advocate. But as I listened to him, he was becoming the devil himself. So the quality of preparations there is absolutely crucial, that you can take each of those roles individually to assess the quality of your preparation firstly and of your input. In the budget allocation debate, the finance mandarins, the bean counters, have a way of articulating and saying things and avoiding things. And so they need to be challenged constantly in a different manner, so that we want these resources to be distributed effectively. There might be a little risk for now, but we can absorb that risk if we carry out what we said we are going to do with the impact it's likely to do. I thought I should end there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tatin Tsenoli. What I would like, just so that, sorry, with that, just before we hear from Dr. Brown, that if you could join me on the stage, I will join you so you're not alone. And then for our Q&A, Kay as well, if you could join us, depending on how time goes. Yeah, on that note, I think there's quite a fair amount in our keynote that we've heard that directly relates to some of what I know Kay is likely to share and Dr. Brown's likely to share on. In part, this issue of the paradigm around public participation and collaboration. What does it mean to kind of meaningfully engage? What does it mean to collaborate? So the paradigms of collaboration. And so before I go on too far, Dr. Kay Brown, who we're about to hear from now, is the Executive Secretary at the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative, CABRI. As I've said, our speakers will be in and out, and so we'll be quite flexible. And if Kay decides to leave us, it's for, she's actually straddling several meetings, as I know many in this room probably are as well. All of us are really just manic in that way. But Dr. Brown is an economist by training. I don't hold that against her. No, I'm joking. No. And she holds a PhD from the University of Cape Town. Her research interests include social policy making and implementation. And maybe just a quick note, one of the people that in her time at the National Treasury, which is a role that she's fulfilled before, was a real champion in terms of collaboration for our coalition in particular. Imali Yethu was Dr. Brown, and you might hear a bit around that in her input. She's lectured at the Nelson Mandela University, and following that, she then joined the National Treasury in 2002, working on a range of areas, including sector policy development. And this, again, earlier we mentioned the sort of post-94 in the democratic space and what that has meant in the context of reform. So I think that Dr. Brown, as with our keynote, Dr. Tsenoli, there's a lot there that we can learn from in the time since then. She has managed the budget allocation process, has made recommendations and ensured that these were communicated to the executive. Again, I think this multi-stakeholder aspect is one that we really need to be mindful of. And I think from our keynote, understanding process, understanding how things fit together can be quite difficult, but is really fundamental, particularly if we're investing time around advocacy. And the other sort of areas of influence and engagement are in the parliamentary space, as well as in other government institutions. The rest of Dr. Brown's bio is there, but what I did want to really emphasize or kind of reflect on was that she was also really key in the context of Treasury's reform agenda. I know that the gender aspect, which came up in our keynote as well, was something that is quite close to Kay's heart. And I know that for many in the room, I'm looking at a few that I know are really invested in that space. Gender budgeting and gender budget reform has been an area of contestation and difficulty and challenge, but also an area where there's been great milestones. Without much more from me, I'd like us to welcome Dr. Brown to the podium, and I think her presentation will shortly be put up. Welcome, Kay.
Good morning, everyone. Apologies for being late. I just wanted to share two things, before we start. I was just reminded about where we've come from and the struggles we've had and the ways in which we approach things. And as Honorable Letsonoye was talking about, the past and so on, I was reminded that the first Minister of Finance told me that when he woke up one day and he was the minister, as opposed to the previous day when he had not been, and the press called him up and asked him for a view on something, he was starting to give an answer, and suddenly he realized he had a different mandate. So I think the important thing is, where you stand sometimes depends on where you sit, and you always have to be mindful of the fact that where you sit is going to be different tomorrow than where you do today. So from the point of view of participation and interaction, we always should be open to hearing each other and adding more meaning then to even where we sit currently. And we're going to take that with us to where we're going to sit in future. And then I absolutely cannot resist saying something about gender. And that is that we have to move beyond gender budgeting and into proper gender planning. So it's one thing to count the impact we're having, which is very important if we don't know what that is currently. But we also need to get to the point to targeting what actual impact we want on women and in terms of gender more broadly. So, but anyway, let me start then with where I'm supposed to start. So I think we are all here to explore the potential of meaningful collaboration and participation so that we can have improved accountability. Can we move the slide? So it would be remiss of me not just to say a little bit about where I currently sit. So I'm the Executive Secretary of the Collaborative Africa Budget Reform Initiative. It is an Africa organization, and the members are senior budget officials of the countries that are members, and all African countries are welcome. Not all countries happen to have joined up yet. It's a formal accession process through Parliament. South Africa hosts CABRI, and the head office of CABRI is in South Africa. And essentially, it's a network of heads of budget offices of various countries focused on budget reform, or in economist speak, to strengthening public finance capabilities and systems. But essentially, strengthening systems is reform, and you do it for a purpose, and you must know what purpose you do it for. If we can just move on. Just a quick flick in terms of who our member countries are and who our participating countries are. Even countries that are not members are still welcome to our events. And obviously we have a broader vision for Africa and budget reform coming up from the South. And then there's just a quick picture of the countries that we've been working in our last strategic planning cycle. So you can see we have quite a broad footprint. We're really interested in what works, and we talk about the practice. So while others may issue formal guidelines and look at things academically, there's a place for that. But we're really interested in helping heads of budget office in solving the budgeting problems that they're having in their countries. We can move on. Thank you. That was, if you like us, please follow us. If you want to tell your sister networks to get their budget officials to join, please do. We can move on. Okay, so I think I'm going to, this is going to be a little bit more perhaps practical and bean counter-ish, if I may say so. I think maybe I must wear the label proudly. That is where I came from. So we've definitely heard about successes and challenges of parliamentary oversight, and I suppose by extension, oversight in general, but very important to all country systems, of course, parliamentary oversight, because that's where your law gets made. So what are the successes and challenges then of participation more broadly? And as civil society organizations, you will be looking at what you should do. You have limited resources, both in terms of people and finances, and how best to spend your energies and where you'll get the biggest impact in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, you're going to forgive me, but I did this on purpose in terms of just showing you that when you engage, for example, with the Treasury official, you are engaging with the bean counter, and they will see things a little bit more literally, perhaps. So I purposefully looked at what would be the aim. So I presume no one minds me having gone onto the website and then saying, in terms of a reading of that, if you're an economist, you're saying what we are trying to do in terms of the Health Technologies Advocacy Coalition is to ensure that we have, and this is literally off the website, appropriate policies, and I put in brackets what that could be many things, and budget mechanisms could be many things, so that we can target 2% of health budgets on medical R&D, giving us life-saving health technologies, leading to availability of health services where it's most needed, and importantly linked to that is affordability and high impact. So why I deconstructed that a little bit was actually just to demonstrate that there are various aspects to this, and depending who you're talking to, people will focus on different elements of it. I think this goes without saying, but nonetheless, it is important if you are going to participate with other parties to think about exactly what it is, which element of that are you extremely tied to, and which elements are points that are ancillary. Bearing in mind that whoever you're talking to might come at it from a slightly different angle. So in terms of looking at that, then you can look at whether or not you have an entry point to participate with somebody. So if you, for example, considering participating with the line ministry, with health, or with the provincial health, national, or with the national treasury, you will look at whether or not you have authority. You don't have formal authority as a civil society to do that. That doesn't mean it has to be an obstacle, but it's things you need to consider. For example, Parliament would have much more authority to speak to a health ministry. Whether or not you have acceptance, which again is something that is, if you don't, that doesn't mean you can't work on it or put a different perspective on it, and whether or not you have ability. So essentially, if you don't have a partnership, you start with nothing. But that doesn't mean that's where you have to stay. You have to constantly assess and constantly look at if you can find a different way of achieving this. So for example, on the gender example, yes, gender budgeting, an important thing to achieve where there was nothing. Now we're still trying to achieve it in the sense of implementing it really properly, but we can't be complacent. In terms of what I'm going to share with you, it's just some considerations around my experiences in terms of the Vulekamali portal, which was developed. The portal is an interactive portal with information on it. It's not the official website, and it's meant to be serving the needs of the public in terms of providing information in a way in which the public wants it. And even that, I think if you state it like that, providing information in the way the public wants it, I think all of us have something in our head. And every single one of us that participated in the development of Vulekamali, what we have in the end wasn't what we perhaps had thought initially. I think there were some, and this is what I tried to put here, some unwritten T's and C's or conditions attached to what we were doing, or you could even say prerequisites to us having a meaningful partnership. So I think some of these things weren't articulated, but they were, from my point of view, some of the things that we grappled with internally in the Treasury, both in terms of I think consciously, in other words, conversations we'd had, and also things that if I reflect on it, I think that we basically dealt with, even if we didn't write an MOU out between ourselves in order to get the Vulekamali work done. So there were some important principles. And I think Honorable Letsonoy said it as well. He said, when you participate, you can be accepted or rejected. And you must accept that all of this is a possibility. And of course, you can change all of this as you go along. But so the one important thing was each of the parties, i.e. government and civil society, retain their autonomy and keep their mandate. So just because you're interacting with civil society doesn't mean that civil society is not going to bring litigation against you. Just because you're interacting with civil society doesn't mean that some of the things that you'll do in terms of policies and whatever are just going to now miraculously be perfectly aligned to the conversations that you've been having. So it was important in terms of maturity to understand that each party still has their own mandate. They have their own way of executing what they need to, whether it's bean counting, being in charge of a sector policy on the one hand, or whether it's advocacy on the other. And also another important principle, which again, I don't think these were explicit necessarily, was that there always had to be inclusion. So I think it was really important from government side that in the way in which we conceptualized it, it wasn't going to only be something from the National Treasury. We were going to bring on board line ministries, etc. We were not going to exclude anyone. And similarly for civil society. In fact, when we first started, there was no Imali Yethu. And we started speaking to various individual civil societies that organically and naturally through their own processes formed Imali Yethu in the end. But a key thing is that that membership to Imali Yethu is open as well, because otherwise, certainly from government's point of view, one would be cautious of being accused of capture, which, yeah, depending on where you sit, it is or isn't a big thing, but it can end up being quite a big thing. Then I think the important thing is that there had to be commitment and conviction that we could achieve whatever it was that we agreed to do. So we discussed many things. Certain things we couldn't agree on doing together for whatever reasons and on whichever sides. But the things that we did agree to do, we worked very well and hard together on. And we really made sure that they would happen. And in a sense, I think for all of us, it wasn't worth it if we didn't think that it was going to add value. So either you took it seriously or, we could just go on our own paths and achieve the results that we currently achieve. Then I think the other important thing was understanding boundaries. So, and again, I've done this slightly purposefully because I know this probably isn't the way in which you might view this, but from a government perspective, you're used to service delivery. So whatever you do is freely available and you must make it all available. So in some of the conversations we had, there was a cautiousness about if we do this, how will we know exactly what the public want? How won't we get this wrong? We can't have the responsibility of knowing what the public want. We're here for the purposes of the executive, and we're not very well placed for this. And an understanding that even if you can't deliver this thing completely, when that's normally what you do when you do something, if you put a budget down, you put the whole budget down, no one else puts another part of the budget down. So that's, understanding the boundaries and the expectations, because in fact, civil society never expected that. So Then I think the other important thing is we set up management and governance structures around the projects, which really ensured equal opportunity and equal responsibility. And it was as basic as saying the chairpersonship of the steering committee would always rotate. When we did awareness videos, I mean, this is very basic, but it's important because it keeps everyone's attention. When we did videos, for example, we rotated between who scripted, for example, and who edited the script to make sure that we had the voice from government in terms of what you would want to say around certain things on raising awareness of a budget, that it's technically correct, and then you wanted the perspective from civil society about what people really want to know and what matters to people. And the other important thing was that I think was that we did not hand over the relationship to a third party. So although we had an IT service provider that did used to bring us together, we made sure that we had a working relationship, and we had other projects that we did together as well, and also separately. The important and rallying common aims were meaningful citizen empowerment for service delivery against the people's budget. So I think everybody, including people in government, know that it's the people's money, and no party in whoever we participate with will have 100% authority over the people's money. We're all trying to bring a perspective, whether it's very technical or whether it's very grassroots, somewhere in all of that, you distill the truth, and no one has a perfect truth. The other thing that I think we had common aims around was analytical abilities and having evidence-based rigor to what we said. And that doesn't mean that you have to be this whiz on manipulating budget information. For example, civil society has much better evidence and an evidence base on communities, on what works, on social audits, for example. It's not really, the comparative advantage there doesn't lie within government. And also, we wanted to have accessible information. Okay, right. Some challenges, okay, and I purposefully put there that it was mid-2016, but I think you'll see that some of them still, we worked on them, we've achieved, but some of them still remain. So there's still a need for more disaggregated information, and I mean, we heard that from the keynote speaker as well, and service delivery information and data in a way in which you can match things that make sense. There's still a need for specific skills around analyzing budget information, and that really is a responsibility of government to ensure that people understand the way in which it puts things together and the way in which you deconstruct it. What does it mean if you call something capital spending? What does it mean if you know, that kind of thing. And if people want to work on the budgets to understand how they're constructed. There was a range of different views, and the coordination of that was also something that always needed to be paid attention to. That was both in terms of within government, but also within civil society. As I said, initially there was no Imali Yethu. Even today there is a Imali Yethu. And of course I'm not part of Imali Yethu, but I can bet my bottom dollar that there are different views and different requirements of each of the members, and that is something that constantly has to be discussed. So the other important thing is the different nature of relationships, for example, with Treasury and the line departments. And there are many misconceptions, probably not in this room, but for example, that Treasury, I'll speak my word right, Treasury is responsible for making the budget, whereas in fact, the approval of the budget does not lie with Treasury. sector does not even lie with the executive. But in terms of where the citizen sits, there are different impressions, and those kinds of things are also subliminal things that we need to deal with so that people properly understand where they have the levers to make change. There's, of course, the timelines of the budget, as much as what they can be worked around. You know, February every year comes around, February every year. You do actually only have 12 months, but what you do in the 12 months can change. Then I think some of these other ones in green are perhaps more difficult to grapple with, but obviously still there. Where are your interaction spaces? Is it in the budget preparation with the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, for example? Do you go and talk at a higher level with Parliament and with the Ministers' Committee on the Budget on priorities? And then also interact in the parliamentary process as the budget is approved, and also perhaps work on special projects. There are various different spaces and there are various different things that one can work on. The role of social audits in achieving value for money, I still think it's an area that has not been leveraged as well as it could have. Extending and sustaining citizen-owned publications on the budget or on budget of sectors or specific element. And the need for deeper and wider CSO engagement with a specific purpose. So where the end in mind is clear to all, even if the path is not. So what you're doing together is important. The how you do it, or what you consider, which of these things become challenges, which don't, they're all really important. And don't forget about the citizens. One of the really nice things about developing Vulekamali was that we went to see the people, we developed the portal together and in iterations, and every time we had a different version, we were still literally going to town halls, we had picked different types of stakeholders, but we went throughout the country. And people were telling us what they wanted to see. So that was really important. So what and how is important, and the when. And then what's the possibility? The possibility is that you're going to make chocolate together without ever knowing ahead of time that chocolate existed, that you'd like it, or that even what the recipe was. In other words, it's really about co-creation. If you're going to add value in your participation, you're going to achieve something you can't achieve on your own. Why else would you participate? And that's true for all of the parties. And then it was just a provocative question. Why would you do it? You know, you can take stats, you can go, well, we do really well on the budget index, whatever. You should just leave the budget alone and go somewhere else. But I'll stop right there.
Great. Thank you so much, Kay. Yeah, aspects of co-creation and chocolate makes me, I won't even go down that route. So I'd like to open up the floor. I'd like both of our speakers to join me up on the, what is this, a platform? It is a platform, yeah? And then we've got a roving mic, and really, really eager to hear your questions. We're running a bit behind time, so do forgive me if I ask for each question or input or insight to be as brief as you can, succinct as you can, but let's make your point. Let's hear your voices. So if you could please both join me up here, and we will open up to the floor for insights, questions, inputs. I see, lots of fast hands. So great. Please feel free to have a seat anyway. There's so many chairs here. We can choose any. We've also, I'll look in the group for any online questions. Please feel free to have a seat anyway. I'll sit up here. Great. So there was a hand there. There's a roving mic. Go for it.
I don't know if it's working. Yes, it is working. Amanda Wild from the healthcare sector. I moved here 17 years ago from the UK, where we have a national health service, not perfect by a long stretch. So I think my vision is a functioning public health sector for every South African here. And I think one of the biggest observations that we've made over the past 16 years is how siloed and fragmented the process is. And I think you've both touched on it. And we say in healthcare, it's a dinner for three. You're sitting around the table, the first one orders the meal, the second one eats it, and the third one pays the bill. So whether it's privately funded or publicly funded, there's a difference in perspective. I think that's the biggest thing that we've seen is the fragmentation and the lack of getting around the dinner table together in terms of saying, particularly for healthcare, could budgeting and procurement be value-based and outcomes-based, and could the patient be put first, if that makes sense? And it is possible to do, it's definitely possible to do. It's so multifactorial in terms of, is everybody, even if you walk around a hospital, the procurement and the finance team are about as far away from a patient as it's physically possible. If they're not underground, they're in the building at the far end by the nurse's home, or in the tower that's guarded by the dragon at the far end of the estate. And I think it's that fragmentation and lack of cohesion when it comes to budgeting that is being missed. And particularly in healthcare, if we could achieve it in healthcare, we could achieve it in education as well, because it's the same problem for the public goods, health and education. So I think both of you picked it up in terms of how do we bring together those three perspectives around the table at the time when the budgeting happens, and think of everything cohesively and the broader impact of what is happening with the money that we're putting into the budget. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Let's have Tana, I think, straight after. Well, let's take each of the questions. I think I saw 5 hands, and then we'll come back to the floor, to the platform.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Tana Makoka. I wear several hats, but let's just say I'm in the civil society sector. I am not very familiar with the open budget or participatory budget process. I just want to make a point about meaningful public participation in general, if that's okay. So we've had this year 2 Concord judgments around Parliament, and that's at every level, Provincial Parliament, National Assembly, NCOP, failing to enable meaningful public participation, which for me is quite an indictment 30 years into our democracy. I actually sat in on the Concord application about the TKLA Act, and the representative for the communities mentioned gross violations. This wasn't just a simple thing of, you know, not having recording equipment or something logistical like that. Gross violations. And I really want to put this to you, Honourable Deputy Speaker, because you are chairing the subcommittee on capacity building. What stood out to me is that parliamentarians, whether they're provincial parliamentarians or national, do not seem to really understand this legislative mandate. Now, in the representations made by the lawyer, he then set out the jurisprudence that has come out of the Concord the last few years around meaningful participation. And he mentioned 4 things: the opportunity offered to all interested parties to participate, knowledge of the issues, opportunity to have a say, and opportunity to influence the decision. And I feel like that last one is very key, because it's not just presenting the opportunity if you feel like and if you're able to get there. It's about creating an atmosphere where what you say is actually going to have an impact on the process. And I feel like that is where we are lacking across the board, whether we're talking about budgets or legislation. So if you could please just speak to where you think the gaps are in terms of capacity building for parliamentarians. And then for Dr. Kay Brown, if you could maybe speak to, you know, just from a civil society perspective, or from professionals or from academics, what can we do to shape our input in such a way that it's not only just on the table, but that it actually influences things in the direction that we want? Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Andy, a human rights activist and social justice activist. I have a question for Deputy Speaker. You used the phrase accounting for every rand, follow every rand. Um, we've just been dealt with a case regarding the assassination of Papita Diokaran. 1 billion rand so far and counting. When you start talking about accountability and process and procedure, I can't see that flashing a piece of paper, a procedure policy in front of any government official stops bullets from impacting people. When you talk about public participation, we have whistleblowers that are part of the public participation process. But there certainly is no process on how to deal with government officials. My question is, how do we bridge that gap between people sitting in Parliament writing policies and procedures and people on the ground, such as whistleblowers, who are trying to engage in a public participation, which is guaranteed by the Constitution, by the way. The other point is regarding the NHI. As an activist, I decided to use the public health system, particularly the hospital system. I cannot see the development of the NHI without Minister of Health, parliamentary people using the health system, the public health system. It is just too far gone. When you arrive at the hospital at 5 in the morning and you only leave at 2 o'clock just to collect medication, nobody understands that. And until parliamentary members and the Minister of Health uses a public hospital, we'll never get anywhere. I think in terms of budget, it's all well to talk about public participation, but the majority of people in society don't understand this. If it was as simple as casting a vote of we want this budget allocated to the huge potholes in my street, it'd be different. Currently, the police ratio is based on a 2011 census, so there is no proper resource allocation, and that doesn't get down to parliamentary budgetary policies. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could ask each of our participants, like prioritize, just try to.
All right, thank you. My name is Peli Sankomo. I'm a development economist and I chair board of Oxfam. And thank you very much for your input. So I just want to make several points, but I'm going to try and be really brief, Chair. Is that I concur with the last speaker that there's a disconnect between our budgeting processes and the constitutional imperatives. And I know that one would argue that there's a resource issue, but in fact, when you look at the prioritization of what the Constitution requires, of what South African government is meant to meet versus the budgeting, there's a disconnect. And you see that particularly in the zero budgeting approach, which I didn't hear any of the speakers really problematizing, because it assumes that, it's like every year, you live for 365 days and then you get reborn again on the 1st of January, and and because that's what zero budgeting does. Systematically, it kind of like really starts new things almost every year instead of continuity, hence that disconnect. And then the second issue about our budgeting is the emphasis on quantitative outcomes. And the issue is that the developmental discourse is qualitative. There's always qualitative and it's quite continuous. The third issue is that our budget had removed something that is very important, is performance, and it's monitoring and evaluation. So we actually don't know the impact we're making. I mean, the basic issue we don't know. We spend so much money on HIV and AIDS, which is part of the public healthcare intervention. Today, unless we get a donor outside to help us to understand the qualitative impact, we actually don't know. And we spend massive resources. And I mean, this can go on even with the education system. It can go on, all the social policy intervention. And I think the case in point is around the social policy demands now. around the need to increase the grant. The other issue that is quite important, it's linked to the civil society, the link between civil society and government, is the removal on the spending of social facilitation. And that component is so important for South Africa for a number of reasons. Firstly, that we have a history of discrimination and exclusion of a massive population of citizens who actually then have actually not only have an experience, but have a limited knowledge around economic literacy and financial literacy. So when you remove social facilitation, which has been a great lever for government and citizens to continue to talk to each other, actually it means that the way government is just going to deliver what you think is appropriate, but also citizens are always going to be disconnected. I think, Kay, you made the point around the gender budgeting issues. I don't want to believe. I think the issue around municipalities, that's the last point. I think around the municipalities, it's a massive issue, and if we don't really look at it as a sphere of government that is extremely closer. Currently, municipalities are getting 17% of the slice of budgeting, and central government gets the massive. And it's a misnomer because citizens are located in municipalities. And of course, as long as you centralize allocation of resources, right, versus to exactly where you actually require the resources, you are always going to have that tension, and the tension of amongst those is economic migration, because citizens feel underserved within their own communities. Thank you, John.
Thank you for that. Is that our last hand?
I think so, I'm not sure. Can I go? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Matsidiso Lengwasa, and I'm a budget researcher at Section 27. So I had a question for Honorable Deputy Speaker about a remark on the local government allocations and the agreement that there's underfunding. And, so it is fully in agreement, but then to also look at the efficiency of spend, so the quality of spend. And the question I had was, while I am also in agreement that quality of spend is very important because then the funding needs to reach the intended beneficiaries, but how do we ensure quality of spend or the capacity for quality of spend when, but in a context of budget cuts, so it reduces like the reduction of the local government's ability to hire, to have the capacity to build the capacity and to hire people to actually implement these progressive policies that that are designed at national level. So how do we ensure that those rewards are actually filtered down to local governments if they don't have the funding for that? And then quickly for Dr. Kay Brown, just wanted to ask if she could share about her views on the progress on gender responsive budgeting, because last we've heard was that there was the intention to workshop the gender responsive budget guidelines by National Treasury, and just wanted to hear your thoughts on that and what role civil society can play in ensuring that it is shaped in a way that women, like the intended beneficiaries, actually benefit from it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, TD. Was that our last hand?
I just say. So,
yes, please go for it.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ati Diko. I'm the communication specialist at Oram. I have one question. I'm glad there's civil society here. There's also people representing from the government as well. My question is another player that's very important in the space, and that's the private sector. And they, for example, in Alex, there's Alexandra Mall, there's other shops and restaurants there, but there's no accountability of how they actually bring it back to the community. How is the incentive government actually holding accountable the private sector? And why is maybe the private sector not in this conversation? Because they also, for example, the JSE has they make a lot of money from the community, but they're not accountable to the community, even though they get a lot from the community. So how can they help and actually facilitate and also hold accountable the private sector so they can also be part of this conversation as well? Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I am seeing the hands, and I'm being a disastrous chair right now in terms of time. What I will do just very briefly, I think I'm going to ask Thuli to do my dirty work for me and pick the last hand. While you do that, I'm just going to bring in the questions from the floor and really not wanting to, we do want to hear our inputs from our speakers as well. We have one question or an input rather from Bobby Maone, who says, a good presentation by MP Lechesa. How many people are, many people are apathetic towards politics. How do we reinvent citizenship and bring citizens to the table? Another one from Jersey Farm Advice Center. Oh, I love advice centers. What is done to ensure that allocated budgets are effectively used for the benefit of all citizens? Are there any strategies in place to minimize the misuse of public funds and minimize unused funds taken back to Treasury whilst poor and marginalized citizens are dying of hunger? Some of these questions may not necessarily be answerable by our speakers, but I think answer those that you feel comfortable answering. Tuli, have you got our last hand? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mamiki from the University of Johannesburg, but also part of Africa Togo. My question is on government-wide monitoring and evaluation systems. That's a system that was developed. However, I think when I was trying to write my paper as well, it was something that I was looking into researching. However, it doesn't seem to be a system that is institutionalized in these different departments. So I just want to ask about progress of this government-wide monitoring and evaluation system, as well as how can it be used to go into a local kind of way. We've just heard that things like Vulekamali is a digital portal. However, when it comes to government reporting, it's nothing centralized as a digital platform. So how can government-wide monitoring and evaluation system be used as a digital platform for information, as well as be localized to a point where we can see what IDPs, things such as IDPs are being, implemented. So that's my question.
Great. Thank you. I'm sorry to anyone that won't get a chance to answer, but perhaps some of the questions can come right at the end, as we will hopefully have a kind of fuller panel. I'm going to hand over now, starting with the Deputy Speaker, and then over to Kay. Let's have our mic back. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Fiscal to listen.
Please,
who's
yes.
here because both of us come from the same institution. And he works, as I said earlier on, as chair of the appropriation committee. So if he has views.
Please, yes. Yeah.
This is a democratic
Absolutely.
space, right? And being used to allocate time and space to people, I do quickly everywhere I go. No, thank you very much. The overall story, monitoring and evaluation, I want to start there and say that in the recent reshuffle, there was a Minister of Monitoring and Evaluation was appointed. This was one of the developments in the past when there was at the highest level of the DG in the presidency, a person who led monitoring and evaluation. It used to be headed by Prof. Tell you his name now, including the current CEO of AXA. They headed this monitoring and evaluation with an intention to broaden M&E from only just individual departments, but as a government-wide system of following through and reporting regularly against what is presented as the outcomes of work done. That some of the requirements in advance for allocation of funds, I spoke about what has been brought in to assess legislative interventions and the related allocations that will follow necessarily to be persuasive before such agreement is given. So this is a process that clearly is not making the impact it ought to, ideally. So M&E has been like that. I have participated personally in capacity building initiatives, accompanying some of the NGOs that work on this thing to Kenya, for example. And one of the secretary of the legislature, this is MPs learning, is that their job? Very skeptical about whether we should be subjecting MPs he is supposed to be the secretary of generally in what he considered wasteful time. That's not their job, he thought. But after about half an hour of the presentation, he turned and changed and said, no, I recognize what it can do now differently. So that part of the inside the department itself, but the effectiveness of coordination in the presidency is where the challenge lies. That if that's a project evaluation and assessment and whether it's making an impact, they've always been located in the, initially it was in individual departments, but the idea is that it must be across the entire system, and there are weaknesses in extending that more visibly and so on. On technology, there is a strategy of sorts whose intention is to digitize the work of government in order to achieve some of the goals that you are suggesting. In Parliament, we've been trying to, and are in the process of doing so as well, to have a system that we call parliamentary interface that will link from national to provincial and municipal, so that literally, as it happens, we must be able to communicate and share information across the board so that we get quick responses and so on. It will obviously require organization development. In other words, an education of bureaucrats across the board and their political bosses to understand the significance and importance of responding urgently, because technology today allows us to do that. We can move swiftly, provide information so that there's verification of what appears before us. The resolutions that we take as a House, for example, that Zondo spoke about, that there are certain resolutions that were taken in the past that were not followed through sufficiently, that ministers did not respond as the House had required of them to do. And so the parliamentary interface is intended to put timeframes within which we should at least have not only just an acknowledgement, but a progress report on milestones being reached to implement decisions that have been taken. So we are hoping that from the parliamentary legislative sector side, we can add to whatever else the executive has to do internally, having appointed people at the most senior level to undertake this critical function. Maybe one of the things we should do following this meeting is to send you what they say is a progress report on the work they are doing, so that you can share it with participants here. The public health issue, I chair a medical aid scheme for members of parliament, MPLs, and judges. And effectively, the state pays about 4.2 billion in support of these medical schemes, broadly speaking. Medical schemes, private medical schemes. And then for the rest of the population, say 86% of it gets the other 4.2. Near 4.2, when 16% gets supported by that. Part of the reasoning behind the NHI is to reverse that inequity. Dramatically, the formation of what is called the Office of Standards, so that each public health infrastructure is assessed, and having been assessed to meet certain standards, action is taken to put in place to close the gap that exists, so that we prevent the kind of experiences that people have in hospitals, public hospitals especially. And in fact, the former Minister of Health, who's now at Home Affairs, he used to say that there are certain things that you shouldn't go to private hospitals for. He would say that you will die, because that's not what they are designed to do. They do not have capacity to handle those things. You are safer going to public health hospitals. That's on the one hand. So I'm glad you raised this national health services. Some of the most prominent people, including the late scientist Stephen Hawkins, who was a multiple paraplegic, said, if it wasn't for the national health system, I wouldn't have been alive today, even if I'm speaking the way I do at the moment. So the system is intended to go there. Let me just put in this story. The problem arose when in our country, we used to have a system of monitoring prices in the private sector for health purposes. Unfortunately, when the Competition Commission came into being, declared that that amounted to collusion, it shouldn't be allowed. Unfortunately, when that structure disappeared, private GPs, specialists, private hospitals' prices shot through the roof, uncontrolled with nobody taking care of it. Now we are faced with a challenge. How do we reverse that? On the one hand, so that even those who do want private health care must be able to get it at an appropriate prices and so on the one hand, and on the other hand, to expand speedily, effectively, the public health sector for everyone, in fact, for everyone. Very few people would stay in the private sector if we make great progress in the public health sector, from all what we are hearing and evaluating and so on. We hope that some of you will also listen to the Department of Health has a Professor Chris who's leading the team. He will speak soon, or you can invite him actually to come and talk to you, because he has a very useful overview of the process underway and why. That initiative is actually the result of the World Health Organization itself saying, countries, this is where you should move. You can't stay using the American model of health. It's not functioning.
Yeah.
It's dangerous to people's health. So stay away from that expensive system. And so we're hoping that we can make progress in that regard. Okay, corruption is a terrible thing. So the systems that we are putting into place are meant to be as effective as is possible. Not just for, it's not just for whistleblowers and so on. There should be no reason for whistleblowers in the first place if the system works well. But where they do exist, then swift action must be taken, not only to protect them, but to also put into place a system to protect the effects that it has on everybody else and so on. So we are very, these are discussions that are taking place. There's an anxiety that relates to the fact that if you have in your system, now let me put it this way. In 2000, I read a policy document aimed for the ANC policy conference, suggesting that we are already in trouble with the influence of greed arising from capitalist acquisitiveness. We are likely to have serious problems in dealing with this problem soon. But literally predicting some of the speed with which people got bought over with the prospects of being rich, high and mighty, and abusing systems in as many ways as they can creatively use to capture the state and milk it in the way in which Zondo says. So this is part of the overall problems. And even in Britain, the NHS is under attack from very rich and conservative fellows who think it's stopping them making a lot of money because they see the opportunities that are there for people desperate for good health, wanting a good system. So fortunately, I think it's got deep roots and it's surviving so far.
Yeah.
That we should be doing this from below. At a municipal level, for example, you have various departments coming from a variety of sectors wanting to talk to the municipality about this or that project and so on. Now we have the district development model. And so we are hoping that that program is intended to provide coordination, which the integrated development plan is supposed to be. As the name implies, an integrated development plan. Those plans are not of municipalities, they are plans of all of government. Section 154 says, of the Constitution says, national and provincial government must, by legislative and other means, support municipalities. They can't do that effectively if there is no integration. Municipalities themselves will not have that integration if they do not act decisively, assertively against provincial and national sitting on contribution that should be going there. Finance some time back, some years back, produced regulations that required that each provincial and national department must provide an indication to each municipality by April of how much is going to be spent in that municipal jurisdiction, so that by June, July, when these municipalities announce their budget that reflects resources, their own resources, plus resources that come from national and provincial government. But that system has not been monitored effectively, which we ought to be doing, so that we integrate from all angles of the public accountability system. It should not be allowed to continue unchecked. I like the idea of facilitation, because this is a phenomenon that is spoken about in other jurisdictions as well, that we do not have sufficient infrastructure in our country, for example, to deal with the interface. I did mention that in the providing spaces for participation, I suggested that we studied some system somewhere that seeks to do exactly this. In other words, there's a requirement for people to provide input to Parliament. Some of the things they ought to do that for, they don't have clues about it. The stuff is complex. So we need people who reduces this material into appropriate language that people speak, so that people can make choices and so on, because that's not complex, making hard choices. People do those choices every time if they are properly informed. Our own design of public education, communication, is about educating people how best to do input. The second point that is crucial is that people must be addressed and be spoken to into the language they speak, so that material that is generated here, hey, as Carl go George, Pearl, but that we should be able to provide people to speak in the language they speak. By the way, I don't know whether you notice that in Parliament, when anybody speaks in their mother tongue, the silence is loud. Because everyone suddenly they don't even do the normal things they do. They are absolutely quiet. Unless we then speak in English, then they go haywire. I'm misrepresenting my constituency. No, but I'm suggesting that oftentimes the problem is that officials who should be, I have personal experience of this, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone was trying to talk to women in my constituency. I had invited her. She couldn't utter a sentence in Sesotho. Instead kept asking me, by the way, what is this thing in Sesotho? So the conversation was so bad, I cancelled it. Because unfortunately, people don't speak their own mother tongue. And it's difficult. So if you're talking about things that wants to empower people, how are you going to do that if you don't speak their language?
Yeah.
So it's a crucial part of facilitation, of enabling people to be effective in their input. It's a crucial part of that work that we must build. South Africa was called by a global UNESCO report called Culture and Liberty. So South Africa is very good in use of the translation services and their availability. And then they joked at our expense in the Free State that in Kwaku, the magistrate, the prosecutor, the accused are all Sesotho speaking, but the court is run in English. And of course there was confusion and absolute laughter at the way in which all of them could at one point or another correct the interpreter. There's even an interpreter there. So, but the point about it was about the use of these indigenous languages for communication, for developmental purposes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this development, whose interest is it addressing? If it is not addressing those that in fact it, and we have legislation that requires of us to promote indigenous knowledge systems, not just language, but other systems that we have, because in them is contained absolute wisdom that have been acquired over generations, that has been abused by those who have sought dominance of our societies. The private sector, that's an interesting one. In land-leg, I think there are efforts to try and return a lot more assertively the work of the financial sector campaign. Because, by the way, in the United States, where we learned our reinvestment legislation, they said to us they did that because once the banks produce the data of who they are giving money to by way of loans and support for small business, all the activists did was to produce a map that shows you the red lining, that all the darkest areas, there's no flow of funds from the bank there for business or for individual loans, or it's so limited you can hardly see it. So part of the work we need to do with the private sector is, yes, you are right by challenging this forum, that it should just as much as it should be with what we say in the public sector, active engagement of the private sector. Your purchasing run is what power you don't often use. The authority as a one who pays to work with others like you to generate influence and impact on how and where you should be served and in what manner. These malls are not developmental. No question about it. In fact, they effectively kill the small businesses that were surviving in those areas. There are alternatives that can be designed with better impact and results than that model of so-called private sector development of malls and so on. So I guess it's the challenge that we confront in a variety of ways. In other words, our own friends who run businesses and they treat customers and people like you wouldn't want to be treated like that yourself, yet we don't say anything to them, for example. So street committees and those structures were intended to be doing this, ensuring that both private and public treats us as human beings, appropriate to the Constitution, and that they are not allowed to get away with murder because they are making money. It can't be appropriate. I think the question of integration I have addressed partly, but I think it is work that we are trying to encourage committees in the legislature broadly to act together. For example, the economic cluster and or the social transformation cluster, to look at what are the biggest public challenges that confront us, and how can we focus on one or two ideas in this sector so that we make the biggest impact from an oversight perspective, inviting the public to engage in discussions of those issues so that we produce integration from below, so to speak. Because then the executive will be forced to react to that in similar manner. But of course, we often have sessions of oversight in the legislature of different clusters, on the social cluster, on the economic cluster so that you get a sense of who's doing what in those areas. But that's not adequate. What we are suggesting is that this needs to be acted upon more by the legislative sector generally, but also by civil society themselves in a proactive manner. A business calls itself civil society. I don't know what's civil about it.
Thank you.
Sorry if you're a business person. My apologies to you.
Yeah.
I think, no, let me
Great.
let me just say that the quality of participation. We're talking to an agenda that I started with, that we in the civics, we spoke about genuine democratic governance. It isn't genuine if it says that you are going to do whatever you want to do anyway, and you ignore and reject what we want to do on our own, using our own agenda and little resources to which we are asking you to complement. And you want to still direct where things should go and how they should be done. Of course, we must fulfill, for example, basic environmental health and so on, but the quality of engagement is crucial. It's what democracy is. We allow people to get away with murder if in what they call democracy, it's democracy of their views, not anybody else's views. That's completely wrong, and I agree with you that this is the sort of thing that we should be going and moving towards every time, because you wink, it is reversed by others with other interests. This is the necessity for agency and vigilance in the quality of democracy that we're talking about. I think I'll stop here because otherwise the sun will set.
Yeah, please go for it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm well covered, so I think I'm just going to make 1 or 2 extra points. So regarding the input on the UK NHI, I haven't heard your metaphor yet about the dinner table, but my question would be, are you sure we are at the same dinner table? And secondly, or is it a problem that the dinner table is just so huge that we are very far away from each other? But I think the point is one needs to come together, and it has to be citizen-centric. Even civil society representatives, even civil society needs to check in with the people that are the citizens that are getting the services in that particular locality. And I think one of the issues that South Africa faces is also that we're a very big country. And so the best way to deliver water in a particular municipality might not be the best way to do it in a city, even within the same province, let alone in a different province or whatever. And so just conceptually, part of the problem with national policy making, although very well intended, is that we don't have as much latitude and diversity in terms of the actual implementation. And part of the problem, in my view, is that we do need to hear from the people within that location. And it is not for anybody else except whoever lives there within that community to say. I would actually rather, for example, I mean, it's not a nice thing to have to make a trade-off, but it is a reality. I would rather walk a little bit for my water, but my child's education cannot be compromised. I want that money used for childcare or homework classes or something. I'm more concerned about the safety and education of my child than my inconvenience. We, of course, all hope for a world in which nothing is a trade-off, but I always hope that and generally believe, unless people are corrupt, whether politicians, whether it's government officials, whether it's civil society, everybody has the best intentions. They just have a different way of looking at things. And at the end of the day, I think it's about the local solution for the local problems. And in 10 years' time, that particular solution will no longer be the best solution because hopefully there has been development. So I think part of the problem we have in our country is just we're so big and we don't customize enough. And then in terms of how to bring things to the table so that they're not just on the table, but that are really considered within decisions, I think there is, the one thing is you have to speak to the people around the table, not only in those formal podiums, like as in the parliamentary hearings or through the parliamentary hearings. Really try to connect with people as often as you need to, and group and regroup. If you can't find a way of getting an access somehow into a particular line department, try and see if you can use Imali Yethu to speak to someone. Perhaps you'll find another way in, but really have a conversation around what underpins what they see and where are you coming from and what assumptions are you making. And I think in order to influence decisions, both parties need to almost have information that is converging over time. And certainly, if anyone is hawking positions, they're going to be, not constructive in solving problems. And I think that poses more of a problem, I think, but you might not agree with me, but I think it poses more of a problem for civil society, because you have advocacy as a key tool within your toolbox, and you might have gone out publicly and said something like 2 years ago, and now your evidence and where you want to be in position might be different. And I think it's also about a maturity of public understanding that Parliament, government, civil societies can shift positions as well. So I think that's important. That was, I think, the point we're making about the commitment and conviction around what you're working towards and not necessarily the way in which you're doing it. In terms of, I think I've spoken to asking people to vote for things, just an interesting aside there was an initiative by civil society, I think it predated Imali Yethu, Vote for the Budget. I don't know if you remember it.
IBP.
It completely blindsided the Treasury. We didn't know that civil society was doing it. We were talking to them almost every second day, but it's fine because it enriched the debate around the budget. And essentially, they had pulled together a quick online tool asking, these are the following big things that had been proposed in the budget. Which of them do you think is the biggest priority? And in actual fact, that leads me into another thing that I think is difficult in terms of the South Africa context, and that is prioritization. Obviously, the budget must cover every single aspect of government's business, or, of the country's business, public business. Then prioritizing becomes really difficult. And we all know that if one person's focusing on health and another one's focusing on education, and even within health, one is focusing on NHI, but somebody else is focusing on school, clinic services, or whatever, it means that resources don't always get focused. So there is, I think, an issue of prioritization, of saying this is all important, but there's like one or two things that the private sector, that Parliament, every committee of Parliament, national, provincial, government, every level, these are two key things that we're going to want to do together with civil society, all different forms and shapes thereof, and rally to achieve that. And we know that in South Africa we do that. We're those miracle people. We do nothing and then we decide this is what we're going to do, and we build 10 stadiums, within 2 months before the World Cup. I'm showing my age now. But we can do it. But we do need to prioritize, and we need to agree with each other on what the priority is. Okay, then regarding misuse and unused funds. So I think an important thing about, misused funds, that's a different matter. I mean, that I think it's quite clear. You don't want that. You need to sort out what the problem is there. And often that will mean that you need to deal with someone because they've done something wrong. Sometimes it might be a system flow thing, but normally if we use the word misuse, it would mean you haven't used it according to how you were authorized to or whatever. Unused funds is difficult because if you introduce a new program, as with the best intention, and civil society, this will resonate with you probably as well, as with your best intentions and how fast you thought you could roll out, often you don't get there, and funds are unused. But then there are serial events of underuse of funding. It's sometimes difficult to see in government information because, you'll see there's underspending on program X, but the reasons could be different. It could be a new methodology brought on board within an old program or whatever. But the point is, you do need to unpack that. But broadly speaking, there is a principle as well that if you've got unused funds, we've paid interest on that because we've borrowed it. And those interest costs are high in South Africa. I mean, higher than national health budgets in totality, for example. So it's also not all right for a particular institution to know that it would not spend money, but just to try and keep it on its budget anyway. So there are different aspects of looking at that, but it needs to be unpacked, and it's certainly something that civil society can watch. Another important thing I would say in terms of being vigilant around the budget is I often think that the adjustments budget and what gets proposed there doesn't get enough vigilance, because often there you can see these kinds of things repeating themselves. On government-wide monitoring and evaluation, I don't only think that it's about the presidency. I do agree that it is, but I also think that it's about prioritization. Because when you look at each sector has a number of outputs and outcomes. But which of them are the priority? Which of them are just the stock and trade? And which of them really push that particular department and service delivery to the point where what the result will be will actually improve the well-being of people? So I actually think that civil society can do a lot around looking at what the service delivery goals are. And we know there's a disconnect between that and money, and you can't always nicely align them. We know obviously the total budget of a line department, and we know that it has this packet of deliverables. Sometimes we can't do a one-on-one mapping, but maybe that's not even important. Maybe what's important is that we actually get the service delivery that matters. So I think there's a lot of scope there to shape deliverables to what I really want. And just to link back to the example that I was making about gender empowerment, what is really the impact that we want going forward? And every single one of us will actually have a slightly different articulation about it. So there is a conversation, and certainly the Department of Women, Children and People with Disabilities must deal with gender and gender outcomes and outputs, not only, for example, the presidency. And gender budgeting is useful, but budgeting is just a tool. You can, even without breaching any legislation and law that has been made, you can craft very many different types of budget processes. Every year, new budget guidelines are issued. You can put different requirements in there, but you just need clarity from that line department, but also in terms of what the goals are, what is sought by Parliament and so on. And I think the same for parliamentary processes. Yes, we have a Money Bills Amendment Procedure Act, which tells you you've got to do A, B, C, D. You know what? The parliamentarians enacted that. They have amended it once. They can amend it again. If that is what is needed to make sure that there's certain kinds of debates, I'm sure that they would be open to that. So anything that is a process and a procedure can be reconsidered. And what really matters is the service delivery. In terms, my last point I want to make is in terms of finances and some of these really tricky service delivery areas. Yes, they are complex, but they're not impossible. Financial language, you know, I can bring out my economics dictionary out of my head and I can start putting out terms here, and it will be something that will not be inclusive.
Yeah.
And will I have made any other important point that I could make in basic English? No. So I think the important thing is that when you sit around the table, if people are not being inclusionary in the way that they explain things and articulate themselves, they must be asked to do so again.
Yeah.
And, you know, even then, language shouldn't be a barrier. So even a lady who should be able to speak Sesotho and she can't speak Sesotho, she still has to deliver in Sesotho. She must deliver in English, she must deliver she has to deliver services if that's, or deliver the facilitation that she was going to deliver. So I think, you know, we whatever our constraints are, whether they are language, whether they are finances, speaking about them and understanding them and looking at a different way of solving them is going to take us one step further.
Great. Thanks, Kay. Thank you both. I think really great inputs and lots of questions, which is really indicative of who we have in the room and the interest we've got in the room. Thank you so much. Round of applause for both our speakers. Okay, we're going to, okay, could we have the mic to Mr. Buthelezi? And just as we do that, we're going to change things a lot in terms of what we're doing right after we step off from the platform. But yes.
Thank you so much, Program Director. I'll be quick. The issues that have been raised here, I bet you I can take the whole day on them. Secondly, let me latch on to what Dr. K has just said about simplifying the message that you give. If you listen to nurses talking, they'll talk that you don't understand them, and they'll come with all types of acronyms. Same with the lawyers and so on. We economists, we also do that, right, in our corners. But I think what is important is that say it as simply as you can. A person that you know, Dr. K, who was my professor,
Really?
Iraj, Dr. Iraj Abedin, would say to you, will give you a problem, and you put it in a very complicated mathematical equation or complicated graphs and so on, and they'll look at you and say, can you please say what you have just written here in Granny's language? Because that's what we can. When we use these things, it's a way of trying to understand, but it can be said in simple English. I think I wanted to say that. Secondly, on the question of, you spoke about budget planning and gender budgeting between yourself and my boss there. I think an important thing to add on that, which you have all alluded to, is implementation. You can come and canvass implementation and implementation. Fortunately, in the sixth administration, from our committee and from Parliament in general, we have focused on that we get a lot of money coming back under spending. But when people at the beginning of the year, all the departments, they come and they want more budget, more budget, more budget. Come the time of when they must tell us what they've done, a lot of explanations as to why things didn't happen. So as a result, what happened, we decided that we're going to focus on this, and we have made serious improvement. Let me just indicate to you that there was a time when underspending was 18.1% of the total expenditure. And then we improved to 15.5%. Yesterday, I had Treasury appearing before the Standing Committee on Appropriation to come and report on Q1, Q20, 22-23 first term. They are only at 3.2% underspending, right? So very important for us. Let's look at that. But the question remains, what is the quality of spending? what is the value of money that we're taking. At the end of the day, the people who are supposed to receive those services, they must be the ones who say, no, the money has been spent properly. We can show you what is happening. Let me leave that. And then let me jump to this question of because you get it, that we gave you, right? If you have got such adverse audit findings, it's difficult to justify more resources to that place. That's another thing. Lastly, on this one, there is a reason why municipalities from the national raised revenue don't get as much money as for instance, as national. Primary amongst those is that municipalities are expected to generate their own income. They've got many ways of generating their own income. But where I've personally that they can more revenue from them, they can have working so that they can be able to pay for their, when they need to zone, you apply for the zone. Them that we see you coming in the morning and you see you taking man out of here. You need to invest and need to do something here. I think we need to do that. Coupled with that is the responsibility I'm just throwing here, the responsibility to protect what we're having. If you are sitting there in our committee, you hear municipality A or people coming to say, we want a hospital. By the previous day, you saw them burning down the hospital. This is a civil responsibility that these things don't belong to government. These are our things. When something's burning, you are burning your mother's tax, your father's tax, your own tax. Thank you very much, Program Director. I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And some really interesting provocations there, which, yeah, I'm tempted to jump to, but must not. Thank you so much for that. Let's now move on. We are sorely behind time, and I think that's, again, indicative of the quality of our engagements. Thank you both. Step down. Okay, I think thank you so much. We're going to jump straight, and I hope that people have been able to pop in and out, seeing as I've killed our comfort break. So if you are able to pop in, pop out, and so on. We are now going to jump right to Dr. Jantjies, if I'm not mistaken. Yes? Okay, super. We're just, I think, we're doing a sound check. And while we do that, he will be joining the Parliamentary Office. I don't now have my notes with me, but hopefully I get it right, that the Parliamentary Budget Office effectively provides advice and input, evidence-based advice to Parliament, as the name indicates, on issues of public finances and budgets. The other thing just to say is that we will then have Togo and Elizabeth after that. Elizabeth, because she's in the room, we don't have to check so much with her, but we haven't checked to say, is that okay? But I think it is okay, thank you. We have checked with Togo, who's joining us online as well, and she indicates that's fine. So yes to Dr. Jantjies now. Yes to Dr. Jantjies now. Putting people under pressure.
Good afternoon. I don't know if you
and
can
while
hear
we
me.
wait, so us, first we'll just.
Good afternoon, Madam Koto.
Good afternoon, Dr. Jantjies. I'm not sure where you're coming from, but we can, I think, see. Yes, we can see you. We're seeing you on multiple screens. I think the sound.
Is it my sound?
Okay, so we could hear you there.
You're right. Is it echoing? Let me just try something. Can you hear me
while
now?
we do that, yes, we can. The nature, as we said earlier, is that we do need to be flexible. Combine. For here.
Can I start, madam? Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me. I did ask them to sort out my network this side. But I'm starting to hear you. This one. Can anybody hear me? Feels so bad. Can anybody hear me now? It's been embarrassing for me because I don't know whether you can hear me or you can see.
So Dr. Janjis, can you hear me? Great, okay. And I think you now must unmute. We can see you, and I can tell you can hear us. And now we need you to unmute, or someone to
All right.
unmute.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Yes, I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Great, yes. We're going to hand straight from a bit of an echo, so I'm going to keep talking and already introduced, so everyone knows who you are. And
Yep.
over to you and to the floor. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Madam Program Director. Thank you so much. I still struggle to hear, but I could hear that over to you. I hope the audience can hear me. But thank you so much. Good afternoon, or it's afternoon here. Good morning in South Africa. But thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this important roundtable discussion. I do apologize that I'm not able to be there in person. Currently, I'm out of the country on official PBO business. I would also want to greet the Honorable Deputy Speaker, also Honorable Chairperson, who are both my principals, my councillors. So, greetings and greeting to all fellow speakers. And again, once more, thank you so much. And all the audience, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'll just get on to it, so that given that my network has been very accommodative. I think what I was given 10 minutes to the presentation. I struggled to really prepare for this, given so much information that I want to share. But I did a very few speaking notes, which I've shared it down. So I'll just try to talk to those speaking notes, hopefully within 10 minutes. I've not timed myself. The topic of my speak really, the title is, I thought I should share with the audience, with the table, the questions around how has the mismatch between the planning, the budget framework led to the poor socio-economic and macroeconomic outcomes that we have in this country. That's a very long title, but really it's about how we got to where we are and what are some of the key issues that we can learn and how we move forward in this regard. In a way, in this way, I also share our work, how we work, and our analysis in this dealing with this speak. I always like, really, I think my view, it's always good to start the presentation or engagement by touching on agreed upon issues or a common understanding of some of the key issues. And I think the main common understanding, or we can all agree that our current socio-economic and macroeconomic development performances or outcomes have really failed to live up to what we had expected during the time when there was the origin of democratic dispensation. And we have seen, although we have seen a massive gains in dealing with. Hello? Should I continue?
Yes. Please do.
All right, thank you. All right. So I was saying, although we have seen massive gains in dealing with many of these challenges facing our society and economy, there are still a lot of work that needs to be done. I suspect the speakers before me has raised that. I would like to also remind ourselves about really the pre-democratic discussions in the earlier 90s, where the consideration about the post-apartheid government and also considered developmental governance approach to be adopted then. And I think one of the major considerations then was that there needed to be a clear developmental strategic plan, and that the government budget framework adopted had to fit into that strategic development plan. And I think, for me, when we look at the current trajectory, it's clear that the budget framework has largely failed to really fit into the development plan. We've seen more of a other way around taking place over the past many years that we've seen of democracy. Because we can agree that many of the strategic development framework measures that were set out earlier on have really been forced to fit into the budget framework over time. And it's clear that that determination then, which meant that we shifted things around, has really, in our view, a place where led to mismatch in terms of the planning or service delivery aspirations or community development aspirations that, between that and the budget itself. And that was really, in our view, what has caused so much delay in realizing our socio-economic and development aspirations as we have. So in a sense, the mismatch originated within that time when they're not taking away the process of looking at what is the plan, what kind of socio-economic aspiration wants to realize, and really taking the budget framework to fit within that has really led to so much mismatch that we see now with there's so much that needs to be done, there's so much needed budget. So no doubt we can all agree that we have made massive progress in realizing some of the socio-economic aspirations. However, there still remain structural issues in our economy and our society, public finance, which really has made it difficult to reduce inequality, poverty, and create more jobs at once. In our analysis, one of the recent analysis we did, as part of support for oversight, we had contributed to a debate around zero-based budgeting. And in our paper then, we talked about this debate and also reminded members of parliament that this debate has started earlier on in the mid-90s and that it was later abandoned due to the fact that this approach would have meant that the socio-economic rights in the constitution would have to be costed and the budget would have been had to fit to realize those in that regard. But given the trajectory that we decided to take as a country, it would have meant that it would have forced us to change around. One of the matter for further or major consideration in this regard is the lack of thorough proper engagement on how to properly get this match in place between the development aspiration and the macroeconomic framework or budget framework in particular. We looked at let's take the national development strategy as it is, and the main analysis there was about the fact that the plan lacks a clear debate or consideration on how appropriate macroeconomic framework that will ensure strategic plan are actually realized. And not lacking that and not having that proper discussion has really, even when you see even pre-COVID-19 itself, government had already considered that the plans, the MDP plans, might not be realized. Precisely that in our argument, there has been very proper macroeconomic framework thinking around how realized. Over the years, we've seen that the clear evidence that shows that the budget framework that we have, when we compare us with other countries, the limits that we have has been far lower than those of the other countries, OECD countries or G20 countries. When you compare, in particular, and those are some of the countries where some are developing, some of them are also developed. But in particular, when you look at our government expenditure framework, has on average been around 27% of the GDP over the past 30-some years of democracy, compared to OECD spending patterns, which has largely been 40% equivalent of the GDP. And our 27% also is based on 25-24% of revenue and 3% of borrowing requirement in that regard, compared to, as I was saying, these countries where their revenue equivalent to 40% of GDP, and it allows them to be in this way. So in our analysis, we agreed that also based on the literature, our current macroeconomic framework and budget framework, it will likely, looking at our framework, it will likely take us longer to realize human and economic aspirations set out in the Constitution and many other policy documents, if at all we will realize them with the current trajectory. One of the things I want to share with you, Emmanuel and colleagues and members, is around last month we had a very good discussions with our National Treasury colleagues about their planned 2024 midterm expenditure framework technical guidance. And I raised in that meeting, I remember that there is this growing or structural divergence between the planning on the one side, that is, to say, the level of service delivery required in line with the Constitution and so on. And on the other side, there is this continuous strengthening of the budget framework over time. My argument here is that a failure to show an understanding that these variables, planning and budget, has to be understood to be influencing and complement each other, rather than seeing them as threat to one another. And I think that's a really correct issue that in my view that we have to really discuss it quite robustly. And I was quite happy that our colleagues agreed that there is this obvious divergence between the planning and the budget framework, and however, how we differed with the colleagues was around, they argue that actually the planning side assumes perpetual increase in resources over time. My point here is that how do we fail to consider that spending on delivering basic services and investment, social and economic infrastructure will lead to more increase in budget framework? And that's really a message that I'm trying to send out in the discussion in the table today. Over the years, the PPU continuously noted that the budget review, the midterm budget policy, correctly so regularly raised socio-economic concerns linked to unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and the importance of addressing those. However, our concern comes here where these documents over the years is that despite raising this importance of dealing with these socio-economic issues, they quickly move on to raise the issues linked to size of the government debt and debt repayments. Basically, the budget review and a midterm policy statement main objectives are focused on debt payments as a percentage of total budget and so on. And the government argues that the debt is not sustainable because of the debt repayments will crowd out our expenditure. Our view has always been that there has to be acknowledgement that the debt increase, the main budget increase in the main is because of the lack of economic growth and failure to deal with inequality in access of services, health, and many other services to deal with some of the social issues there. In a sense, analysis will show that government has reduced the issue of dealing with socio-economic issues to the size of a debt or debt repayments annually. This is very concerning. This is that government budget framework fails to adequately consider the continuous impact of the long-term fiscal construction and stance on the fiscal space in the debt repayment itself. That the fact that we're constraining ourselves, it does impact the fiscal space or the debt repayment itself by constraining ourselves. An important consequence is that the government is deprived an ability to take a long-term perspective on the budget as a tool that addresses economic development and unemployment and so on. This for issues of economic for household. In a sense, this means that addressing socio-economic rights has been constrained by short-term fiscal objectives. And in this way, the budget treats the poor household as a cost to the budget and a burden to the economy. And I think one of the issue that we're bringing the analysis is to show that actually some of these challenges, social challenges, are actually structural and are directly linked to the dynamics operating in the economy and level of concentration, wealth, and control of markets and access. And the argument we make is the market on its own will not be able to address these structural factors leading to inequality, unemployment, and so on. Our analysis has shown that the current structural reform that government has been implementing over the years will largely retain the current economic status quo and improve the business environment for the existing corporations that dominate in the economic sectors and extract wealth from the economy. In argument, we say it is largely state actions with the budget that will address structural factors limiting the development in the economy. That is deepening and diversifying economic sectors of the economy while also drawing upon the immense potential of South African population that is wasted as a result of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. An important tool in this regard, moderator and honor members and colleagues, is the budget. Therefore, the budget has to be part of a long-term vision and a program aimed at redistribution and economic transformation. In our view, that is in order to address socio-economic human rights, socio-economic rights, it must be acknowledged that an increase in a well-targeted government expenditure on social grants and improved service delivery can improve efficacy on social spending, such as health and education and others, and social security. An increase in targeted government expenditure could add on to the amount of economic activity and productivity to the economy. It can also save money by improving throughput in the education system and pressure on the health system caused by illness and poverty. In conclusion, I think my 10 minutes up now. I think my message here I'm trying to emphasize is that the pressure to constrain government expenditure as a result of the fiscal consolidation seems to be an important constraint on developing long-term development programs that could reshape the budget over time. Therefore, affordability and addressing socio-economic rights in a meaningful way has to be seen as part of the long-term and redistribution program, and maybe then there can also be a very meaningful monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that enable society to keep track on the effect and impact of these budget framework. So I think that's really, I want to stop there. Just a quick analysis, quick point I want to make lastly is that really our approach to budget analysis, moderated on our members as a PBU, is really that doesn't look at the budget as an end itself, but that really see the budget as a tool to transform our society and economy. And therefore, it is always important that when we look at the budget analysis for advisory purposes, we first study the context, social context, and economic context in which this budget is presented, and update members say, look, this is how much progress we've done, and how likely is this proposal able to get us in a better state or improve on where we are in this regard. So I would like to stop there and thank you so much for the opportunity. There's so many other projects that we can share with you in the later stage. Thank you so much. I hope I can be there. Thank you so much. Once more.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Jantjies, and thanks for that input and for joining us from Kenya, Malawi, Kenya. So I think what we will do now, and I think we've just shared this message, I hope, with Dr. J, that we won't go into the Q&A with him now. I know that he himself has to go. What we'll do is try to collect at the end, questions at the end. So please hold on to any inputs, any thoughts on that. Particularly appreciated his reflection on the budget treating the poor or treating vulnerable households as burdens, and many other points that were in there around, focus on debt and so on, which I think are in themselves really interesting points. So thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can still hear us, but please to relay our gratitude in the online platform. Now, I've been told that Togo is ready, our other online person who will go to. I hope you have been catching tea and so on and water. And if you're feeling a bit sort of stifled, get up, stretch up, crouch down, jump up as you need. So we keep going where you are. Yeah, should we jump to Thokozile Madonko, who is currently at the WITS Southern Center for Inequality Studies at the Public Economy Project. Togo also has quite an interesting background. I've lost my note again. She formerly led the Budget Expenditure Monitoring Forum, which has really had some interesting roots in this country and in driving advocacy around budgets and activism. Thokozile is now online. Yes, can we go straight to her? Waiting for her.
Great.
Her bio is in there too. Just reflect a bit more on her. There she is. So go over to you.
Thanks. And thank you to everybody in the room and all protocol observed. It's been really great to listen to the input so far, and quite a bit of what I wanted to say has been touched upon. So I'll try and not take up the full time. And my presentation is going to sort of have two bits to it. The first is just a little bit of building on Dr. Jantjies' input around kind of the budget as a tool for transforming and growth and development in South Africa, and what it means to create an equitable, just, and rights-based country, essentially. And then the second bit is a little bit around some of the reflections I have on the power of budget advocacy for those of you that are wanting to do this kind of work. So just a little bit to take from Dr. K's point about where we sit. So currently I sit at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies in the Public Economy Project. And the aim of the project is to build independent analytical capabilities on macro fiscal policy, public economics, and public financial management. So all things budget. And ideally, we want to support public deliberation on fiscal policy, on the budget, and build capacity and rethink macro fiscal choices. And it's in the rethinking that becomes quite important in our work, which is evidence-based, and to provide potential alternatives to what is presented by the executive each year, or what is presented by Treasury in terms of the macro fiscal framework. As Dr. Jantjies mentioned, the medium-term expenditure guidelines, they set out politically what the budget needs to do, and tells the line ministry. So we have a top-down essentially bottom-up supposed approach to formulating the numbers behind our policy. And I really wanted to just draw on a quote from Thandi Modise, the Minister of Defense, budget speech this year, where she mentions that a scientific evaluation, and I quote, of the SANDF has painted a bleak picture of our diminishing capabilities, largely because of persistent budget cuts. The ravages of underfunding and unserviceable capabilities against escalating tasks has had a devastating effect. Every evaluation process of the Department of Defense points to the inevitable need for more boots on the ground to execute the many tasks given to the department. To the contrary, government directs the downward management of the human resource baseline. It is our duty to reconcile these mutually exclusive positions. Sustained funding of the SANDF remains an unavoidable requirement. And this quote can really speak for any of the service delivery departments. And essentially what the minister is outlining is precisely that disconnect that Dr. Jantjies mentioned around policy and the budget. And so we're beginning to see in our research and work that we've been doing at the center that the continuous austerity that has been implemented over the last decade has really eroded the quality and value of public services on which the majority of South Africans rely. And that these spending cutbacks have been strongly intensified since the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen that this has been in relation to the pay increases for government employees held well below the rate of inflation, and across the board spending reductions cutting deeply into healthcare, basic education, criminal justice, and social services. And so we see that funding for social provision depends on growth, but we've been seeing a real stagnation in the last decade. And this is further deteriorating because of the failures in the electricity supply and the commodity export infrastructure. And this is becoming more and more apparent. And so, you know, we're really in a situation where we have a weakening macro fiscal environment in South Africa. And so to go to my next part of why there's the power of budget work is that it is absolutely critical that we engage in these debates and make sure that we focus both on policy, but also on government budgets as well. So, you know, the famous example of successful budget work is fees must fall. We've seen a massive change in policy, and we've also seen a massive change in the direction of budgets towards higher education. The question is, and Dr. Kay mentioned this, is around trade-offs. What are the trade-offs that need to take place? How do we inform these trade-offs? How do we inform the priorities? And what is the bigger picture versus the smaller picture when you're interested in whether or not your municipality has enough funds to repair or deal with potholes? So these questions cover the entire kind of framework of the budget, but we mustn't lose sight of the larger macro fiscal choices that are being made that then almost bake in what is possible at a much lower level. Whether you're wanting to get greater spending for health in research and development, you need to go back up and ask some questions about the overall framework. So I argue, and many have argued, that we need to focus on government budgets because we do have a responsibility to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values and social justice and fundamental human rights. That's essentially, and Dr. Jantjies made that connection very clearly in his presentation. And we also want to focus on it because it lays the foundations for democratic and open society in which government is based on the will of the people and every citizen is equally protected by law. And the budget as a tool has an impact on that. We also want to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. So we're also wanting to track progress. And so if we're seeing budget cuts, does that have an impact on the improving, on the progressive and promotion aspects of the Constitution? that are set out for example, for access to healthcare or education or social protection or whatever it might be. But we also want to build a united and democratic South Africa. And we are arguing that if we don't address the financial situation, we're going to have likely to have major social unrest as services diminish and tensions rise and more people come under pressure. And so, we need to note, and many of the kind of founding mostly fathers of economics were interested in dealing with macroeconomic issues precisely because they wanted to protect the fabric of society and to have conversations about what the nature of unemployment has on social issues. And we have such a high unemployment rate in this country that it's remiss if we don't pay attention. This has been mentioned that it is about holding public and private power accountable, and this is baked into our Constitution, Section 195, and this was also discussed. And that, one of the things that I want to highlight around the principles is that people's needs must be responded to, and the public must be encouraged to participate in policy making. That's in the Constitution. And so there is, again, and public administration must be accountable, and we must have transparency. And so we've seen major budget reforms in relation to the public access to information. We've seen, we're one of the number one leaders in terms of budget transparency at a national level. So we're ticking the boxes. And so the next step is really about, kind of getting to a point where, as others have mentioned, that we can see value for money. And the nice thing about budget work is that it can bridge both research and advocacy. And so I sit in a research capacity, and so less on the advocacy side. But the advocacy side is as important if you're wanting to see shifts and changes. But combining the two creates a very powerful process. And in my experience of doing budget advocacy work, it is both bridging this research and advocacy that becomes absolutely critical. And though advocacy work has historically been the domain of activists and campaigners, and budget research and analysis mainly in the domain of academics and public finance experts, linking them together is what is so essential. And what holds them together is evidence. And so we have seen in our own work at the center that much of our research is taken on and taken up and used by activists and campaigners in relation to the particular issue that they are wanting to grapple with. So it really is a match made in heaven, and budget research is given more power and relevance, and the advocacy becomes more compelling and persuasive when you bring the two together, which is absolutely critical. I'm almost done. And so what is this evidence-based budget advocacy? What can it be used for? And it can be used to empower ordinary citizens. I've been very privileged to work at a real micro level, trying to access information and get repair done on a sports field in the Eastern Cape, to right up to HIV budgets and tracking them from a macro level. But with people who are vested and interested and are able, you can have access. It also informs public debate. So right now, the debate on the table is around fiscal consolidation and austerity. And is this the right path? And these are critical debates that need to take place. But underneath that, we also need to have the evidence, or at least alternatives, presented. So come the medium-term budget policy statement, ideally, we would want 1 or 2 or 3 other policy options on the table so that we can inform public debate. At the moment, it's primarily from the executive that we're seeing, and very little alternative budget debating, which is needed and is absolutely essential. It can bring about policy changes. We've seen coming out of the gender responsive budgeting work and out of the children's budget and a number of long-term initiatives that really saw the increasing of the grant system to make sure that it covered children and covered children at the right age for the right period of time. So we've seen allocations change there. Of course, we saw the battle that was won by the Treatment Action Campaign around accessing antiretrovirals. So it can bring about policy changes. We've seen the NHI, which is a huge reform. And the question is, how will that reform be financed? And that's now in the domain of debate. And so these things can be shaped. I want to encourage you that, there have been some major wins. And of course, I mentioned the fees must fall. There's a myriad of examples. It can improve delivery of public services. This is something that Dr. Kay alluded to around social audits and ensuring that you follow the full cycle and seeing the outcomes of an allocation and tracking the performance of a particular service provider. This work has been done. There's some excellent examples around sanitation and engaging at a real micro level in relation to services. It can also promote more transparent and participatory and accountable budget processes. So we take for granted the amount of input that happens in Parliament, and the Parliamentary Budget Office can speak to it as well, is that there is enormous interest and engagement in the budget process. And from across the board, both from civil society, the private sector, there is an investment of time and energy, and for some organizations, money, in being able to participate in these processes, and they are taken seriously. And now with the fact that Treasury has to respond to those inputs, you're beginning to see a much greater debate taking place, which is absolutely critical. And and Treasury should be commended for ensuring that it does this part of its responsibilities under the parliamentary processes. And it can enhance the credibility of advocacy efforts. So I really want to say, so just to end off, I've run out of time, is that the power of budget work is that it's about increasing participation in the processes of government, both on policy and money. So it asks both questions. Advocacy interventions, where they take place, begin to ask questions about who are the decision makers, what is being decided. So that question around prioritization, how are decisions made, process, and how are decisions enforced? What is the implementation, evaluation, and monitoring? And where you have the greater opportunities to intervene, or where you would like to crack open that space and intervene more greatly. So I really want to encourage those of you that are new to budget work and budget advocacy work, that this it can have a huge impact in health financing and health policy, but more broadly around creating a far more equitable, equal, socially just society. So I hope that's a little bit of a rah-rah as I close off.
Who thankfully is in the room, so we won't have the breakup. So Dr. Elizabeth Binney is from Equal Education and is a researcher there. So I'm now throwing in things that are not in her bio. Her organization is a member of Imali Yethu coalition, and she herself is one of the champions around the work of open budgeting. But just very briefly to say that Liz is an emerging scholar and interestingly has published in both national and international peer-reviewed journals and has a background population and health research and has done, or rather did a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Northwest University, amongst many other wonderful things, which you'll soon discover. over to you, Liz, as our final speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Zuki. And just as a disclaimer, everything you read in that bio is a lie. We are told to package. So if you go and Google and do whatever, that's your business. Thanks for having me, and it's been very interesting conversations from the very start, and obviously saving the best for last. For those of you who are not aware, she signed a contract. No, I'm kidding. So I'm from Equal Education, and just as a context. So equal education is a democratic social movement of learners, teachers, parents, post-school youth, and community members who are advocating and obviously working towards ensuring that there is equal and quality education in the South African system. And part of the work that we do, obviously, you can't have equity in access and quality without equity in resources, right? And so almost always the money conversation comes up. Either the people responsible or mandated for providing the services that we need are saying they don't have enough money to do it, or they can't afford it, or some other story of money comes in. And so perhaps it is not strange that, let's say, you'll probably be wondering, what has budget got to do with eradicating pit toilets in Mashashani, Limpopo, or replacing mud schools in rural Transkei, in the Eastern Cape, for instance? And essentially what we are trying to do as an organization is that we are not only making demands of government based on our feelings, because I think there's that assumption that young people are emotional. We wake up one day and then we choose violence and we go to the street and we want to toy or protest. But what we do as an organization, and what do you call it? Togo alluded to that in her presentation, is to be able to bring the evidence into the advocacy, right? So evidence-based advocacy. And so we do research, and while our research might not be necessarily as academically focused as Togo's, ours is more socially inclined. We are bringing people's lived experiences into the advocacy and the demands that we make of our government, right? And so when we are talking about budget advocacy for us, we are in no way claiming we are experts in the area. We are not economists. Half the time we also have to teach ourselves the terminologies and Google and learn and understand and grapple with some of the concepts to be able to then relate it to our members' experience, help our members understand so that they are better able to engage with some of the issues that come out of it. And so for us, and interestingly, when Comrade Deputy Speaker was speaking this morning in this triangle, while people find us to be at the end of the opposer, we are not always opposing. We are sometimes also movers, maybe, I don't know, we are maybe claiming too much, and maybe sometimes we also find ourselves at the bystander perspective. But the essence of what we do is that we want to contribute to making things better and not necessarily just raise hell for the sake of it, right? And so in terms of our budget advocacy lessons, what we do or what we have done, lessons learned and challenges, it is also important to maybe segue it this way, that there is no one standard method of advocacy, right? So what works for us might not necessarily work for SAHTAC or another organization, but I think in principle we can
pick some of the things, easily transferable methods, and apply it in our individual context and see how it works for us. So sometimes it is by trial and error. So for us, in terms of budget advocacy, participation is very important in, as a primary principle. And when it comes to the participatory aspect, and I mean, sometimes we always criticize, but sometimes we also have to hype the people who make things happen. We find that in the parliamentary spaces, that has been a very fruitful or worthwhile relationship, right? So when the calls are put out and then we go and we make submissions, it is an engaging environment. The select committee, and I'm not trying to make him feel nice because he's sitting here, but the committee on appropriations are really accepting and accommodating of civil society and the public at large when it comes to engagement on aspects of the budget. While that is true, we don't believe that we necessarily make impact in those spaces, right? Because that process is a foregone process. So by the time we get to parliament and we are speaking our English and trying to lobby and woo all these MPs, it is a done deal, right? So we might not necessarily be making the impact that we think we are making, but we still maintain that it is a useful exercise to participate in, because you don't know when your numbers were hit. And so in those, we always engage in the call for comment and the oral and written submission to the parliamentary spaces. And while those spaces might not necessarily be very accommodating of everybody, we think that it is beginning to ease up a little bit into bringing some of the diverse voices into the room, right? So it's not just listening to your trade unions and those people who have political clout, but other organizations, maybe such as ours, that might not necessarily or traditionally fit into those spaces. And so in that regard, also initiatives like the Fiscal Open Accelerator and the budget lock-ins and those kind of engagement with Treasury has been very meaningful and helpful in trying to increase participation and also inclusivity in that kind of what would traditionally be a highly technical and intimidating space, right? So we found that useful. With all that said and done, we don't think, well, I personally believe that it is not useful to encourage participation for participation's sake, right? And one of the most important and critical aspect that maybe we overlook or we take for granted is knowledge or literacy. So that understanding that the public will need to have, the base level of understanding that they need to have to be able to engage the budget, right? So in our organization and for our members, we try to break down the language. But even when the language is accessible, if people don't have the base literacy or understanding, there's no amount of translation and dumbing down, so to speak, will help. So we have I don't know if it's a mandate, but I'm giving us a mandate, I guess. We have a responsibility to make sure that we are actually empowering people with the base literacy and understanding so that they're able to give those, they're able to, interact with the budgets to a degree beyond the budget speech where they watch the news or TV, it's over and then they move on with their life. Because these policies have real social and lived implications on their lives. And I think that area that we are neglecting is doing a disservice. All right. Beyond participation, oversight is also a crucial aspect because, as we have heard today, that implementation is important outside of the policy making itself, right? So we can have all the sexy legislations and budget numbers that we want. If the departments responsible for implementing or rolling out those mandates are not actually doing their job properly, properly, then we are essentially pouring money into leaky pockets. And that is why we are also careful in our requests or in our submissions, that we are not only asking for an increased funding for our sector, for instance, basic education, but we are also asking for increased oversight for the way these sectors you make use of the money, so that we are ensuring that we are reducing irregular and fruitless, those financial misappropriations that really at the end of the day rob people of their right to important basic social services. And beyond the watching, where following the money and making sure that the money is spent right is also value for money as well at the end of the day. So monitoring and oversight for us, while we can't be assured that comrade CISO is going to go to every department and critique every line item and make sure that it is spent right, we do our part in that. We also interact with the individual departments that are responsible for rolling out or implementing those budgets to make sure that the gaps, any red flag is highlighted. So I'll give an example, for instance. Basic education can come to parliament and tell them, everything is right, we've built 200 schools, kids are eating 7-color meals for lunch, and it's great, right? But then we go to those schools, we monitor at that micro level, so we can and all our members can alert us to what is happening within those schools, so we can have real evidence to refute such claims that no, they said we gave them money to provide kids with food, but instead they are using the money to settle court cases that they didn't plan for. So those kinds of monitoring at that micro level is important to ensure that the money is also going where it's supposed to go, right? And obviously, issues like, I'm sure you interestingly, Mail and Guardian is a partner. So you, in the news, you hear, hey, equal education is standing outside parliament protesting, yada, yada, yada. It, to the ordinary person, it might not make sense. Like, why are these kids always out in the street protesting? But I can assure you that it's part of a broader strategy that actually moves the needle, however slow it is. So I'll give you one real example. When COVID hit, nobody expected it to happen. Treasury did not expect it, and therefore they didn't have room in their process to mitigate shocks like that, right? And so what they needed to do was rob Peter to pay Paul. And suddenly, basic education is not, what did they call it, frontline department or that terminology. And so they cut the basic education budget to be able to now go and provide PPEs and nose masks and your sanitizers for other departments. We took to the street and we objected those budget cuts because already we are finding ourselves in a sector that is struggling to educate the average child to be able to read for meaning. And so taking that money to provide COVID, so we all survived COVID, but we don't know anything because we haven't learned anything in those years that COVID was killing us. And so we don't know, we can't raise the next health expert to be able to, plan and save us from the next COVID in the future. So those kind of advocacy might seem a little bit, trivial and unnecessary, but it does get a reaction or a response, however late, in the process. So, like now we are seeing a recovery in the sector budget, and that is a good sign that we might be shouting on like hard of hearing, but something enters slowly. So another example I could give is in the education sector, we have as a conditional, a special grant called the Schools Infrastructure Backlogs Grant that was initiated to basically help fast track the delivery of school infrastructure, the backlogs, to clear the backlogs in the system. So I think a year or two ago, Treasury alerted us to the fact that that grant was basically a special thing. So it was going to come to an end this year, right? This financial year. And we made our dissatisfaction or our feelings known about it. Media statements, your usual, cocktail of advocacy communication tools. And to our sort of great joy and probably a victory is that this year they decided to extend it for another 3 financial years, right? So that to us is important. Like, we might not be economists and the right technocrats to be able to speak on budget issues with confidence, but I think it is important to also bring in the social and the human elements to the budget as well in how we advocate for reforms and changes, right? So we can't always rely on the economists to give us what we want. We need to show them how these technical decisions and issues impact the real people, the lived experience of someone in rural Limpopo, in rural Eastern Cape, who cannot and probably does not have the privilege to be able to log on to Zoom and give a very eloquent submission on whatever it's in there. So advocacy is important, yes. Language and accessibility is important, and part of that requires public education so that people are better able to engage with. And the last thing I'm going to say is that, yes, research and advocacy can come together in a really nice blend to be able to also get us what we need. It does not necessarily have to be academic. It can also be social and on the ground. So we don't have to work at a university to be able to call ourselves experts in a certain area. I think wherever we are as civil society, we have expertise in those areas and we should be able to use it to further the agenda of our various organizations. I will stop there and we can engage further in questions, yeah?
Thank you very much, Liz. Yeah, and I know you could go on for a while on this area of passion and experience. So I've got the sad news that we can only, and really I think it's even pushing it, taking any questions at all, but I'd like to still hear a few more from the floor. So we're going to take that's it we're taking. That's all we're taking. I'm sorry. The fastest hands were first. So 2 questions. Togo is still online if you'd like to engage her. We've got Mutlatsi at the back, and then we've got a hand here, and I'm sad to say that's it. What we can do is, if there's really pressing questions, we can follow the speakers home. I'm happy with that. Okay, so Mutlatsi, and then hand at the front, and we'll.
Thank you, Zuki, and thanks everyone. So I'm Mutlatsi Komote from Corruption Watch, the Budget Justice Coalition, and Imali Yethu, so quite a lot to say there. It's actually just a general observation and comment really that I had from the morning around some public participation processes that have occurred previously or are still ongoing. So for example, the Fiscal Openness Accelerator is one of those public participation spaces that many of civil society organizations have engaged in. And I know that the Open Budget Survey had actually ranked South Africa 19 out of 100 for public participation in 2021, which was a little bit higher than the global average by, I think, 5 points. But my point is to say, how do we ensure that the gains from, for example, the Fiscal Openness Accelerator processes and others where civil society organizations had the ability to engage on the budget pre the engagement in Parliament are not lost, because that was a pilot phase. And so I'm wondering how we can continuously strengthen those engagements for us as civil society organizations. Because I think that the engagement that CSOs had there speaks to the meaningful contributions that the public and civil society want to make and can make. And then I think in terms of Liz's point around the foregone processes, I think that's what I'm referring to there. And then just noting again, just to give a bit of background as well for the benefit of everyone here, when we had the budget process in February, March this year, one thing that really stood out was having the widows during the parliamentary public hearings who actually came and said to MPs, we want you to listen to us, we want you to hear our voices. And in fact, one of the considerations that those MPs had to make in the committees was the fact that they actually needed to go meet those widows face to face, because the widows wanted to be heard and wanted to engage. So members of the public want to engage in these processes, but I think there's a lot to be done around budget literacy, and I'm very glad that Vulekamali, and I'm not saying this as part of Imali Yethu and everything, but I'm very glad that there's Vulekamali and that different civil society organizations are contributing and working towards this. But yeah, thank you. So thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. I've introduced myself earlier, Peli Sankomo from Oxfam. I mean, I'm interested to hear from Thokozela around whether there's room in South Africa with the work they're doing around additional progressive taxes, right, to particularly drive transformation in South Africa. That's the first issue. Then the second comment I want to make is that I think the civil society organization, one of the things we seem to miss, by the way, it's what we call medium-term strategy framework of government, which happens every 5 years. So if, for instance, you interact either with portfolio committee or the executive within that 5 years, there's very minimal that you're going to achieve. Just for information now, the cycle of medium-term public planning process is coming to end in 2024. So in essence, there needs to be an intense engagement across with Parliament, but also with departments, because then they're starting another cycle of another 5 years planning. Because then in essence, if we're not involved in that early 5-year planning cycle, what happens is that bureaucrats will just plan on our behalf without any finding that there's no concomitant planning between what society and citizens of Africa are looking for versus what we're looking for, what officials are allocating. The other issue, I think, I would really like to reflect on your point, Dr. Liz. I think you applaud the attitude of the committee towards the advocacy work we're doing, but also the richness and the quality of the conversation. But I'll be keen here to reflect whether when you interact with the department, what actually happens, whether you actually have a very similar attitude in relation to that. But I think the work you're doing around targeting young people and working with young people is actually excellent. Well done. Thank you.
I'm sorry. How easy is it to start with Togo? Okay, let's cue her up. Hopefully she heard the questions.
Can you hear me? Okay, so I'll go ahead. Yes, thank you so much for the questions. I think the question around taxation, if I understood it correctly, the sound was a little bit fuzzy, but this is the point that I want to raise, is that we're not having those debates. We're not talking about our fiscal framework or the fiscal framework sets the scene for everything else. And it has to be passed before anything else gets passed, before the division of revenue, in fact. The fiscal framework has to be approved. And this has really not been tested. And this is where Parliament has the ability to amend the budget, really, the power. I mean, it can amend the division of revenue as well and the appropriations. But the fiscal framework, the decisions we make about how we raise and spend money, the issue around our debt portfolio, the issue around how we redistribute income and wealth in this country, And the question around taxation is precisely that. Who will bear the burden of providing services? And according to our constitution, it should be progressive, it should be equitable, and it should be redistributive. And at the moment, we're seeing with the fiscal consolidation that in fact the burden is being placed on low to middle class working South Africans in the state, who's not seeing real increases in their salaries, cuts to service provision. So again, it's low to poor South Africans are facing the burden of the current fiscal framework. And so that really needs to be debated and discussed. And the medium-term budget policy statement is meant to ignite that conversation. And so we did some research on fiscal institutions, and there was an argument to be made about bringing that forward, because there's just not enough time in the 3 months between February to really grapple. And again, I agree with this idea around the fiscal openness process, that there are some conversations that need to take place with line ministries and with Treasury around these very questions, and they need to be debated. So, I don't particularly, I have a position around this myself, but as the center, we don't necessarily take a position other than showing what the current framework looks like and what the implications of the current framework. And the implications of the current framework is that there is no money. And that services are in fact going to deteriorate. Their cuts are going to be deep, they're going to be harsh, and they are deeply, deeply concerning. I think that's the main thing I wanted to say.
Thank you very much for that. Elizabeth, brief. Oh, we need a mic for Liz.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Okay.
So the question really was around the relationship at the parliamentary level seems to be quite great. How about departmental one, right? And I think everybody who works on like single issues in the sector will attest to this, that we do have champions, and these champions tend to be in those spaces at the national level. But when it comes to real departmental, like the implementers of the issues, that's where the problem starts and the relationship gets a little bit sour, right? And I think it is also, maybe there's historical animosity in that we are seen as criticizing and not necessarily collaborating or encouraging. And so departments tend to have that knee-jerk reaction when you want to engage them on those things. But I don't think that is also, that should deter people from also, interrogating at that level. So for instance, I'll give you 2 examples. We work, one of the provinces we're very active in is Limpopo. Now, when you go to Limpopo accounts for a significant proportion of the school infrastructure backlog in the country. Like the pit toilet situation is wild. And yet, since 2011, they've consistently underspent their budget on infrastructure. It is crazy to us. We march, we go, court orders, the usual thing. They wake up, they do something small, and then they go back to sleep again. So the point is that we need to get to that level of monitoring and applying pressure at that level. Because the other issue is, and I'll probably be arrested for it, but when they go to parliament, they lie. Like the progress reports that they are saying and what is on the ground or the lived experience of communities do not always match, right? So they are ticking boxes somewhere, and we are reading all these fancy reports, but then you go and then you see the situation is the opposite. So I think in terms of monitoring and also oversight, we cannot just leave it as the responsibility of the committees or, Parliament. I think we need to really get down to it and do it. And perhaps where we are failing also, and we are part of it as an organization, is that we are not treating the provincial spaces with the same rigor and, keen eye as we do the national budget. We are always doing the big one, and we're releasing statements, doing all those things. But then a lot of shenanigans also go down at the provincial level, and we need to start looking and poking holes in that spaces as well.
Great. I'm going to look away and pretend I'm not seeing these hands. So this is what we will do. Thank you so much for all the input. I'm really cognizant of everyone's time. This is what I'll suggest, is that really, if you can keep it to 30 seconds, I'm handing over now officially, essentially, to my colleague Sakile from SAHTAC, who will close us off with a call to action, essentially. And I think she's been picking from the room key inputs. And while she comes to the podium, we can do the last two if they're very brief. But otherwise, Sakile will close us off, and she will also do our vote of thanks in addition to the call to action.
No, so just one thing. I think the question of activism, protesting, and so on, most of the MPs who are us also were a product of that. So continue doing it.
A member of COCTA, the committee I chaired, says to me when we're looking at one report, he looks at it, he says, Chairperson, this is a work of fiction. Now, I'm saying don't make the mistake because people have the wrong way. Provide the information. It makes a huge difference. Someone else will pick it up and raise it. It will make a huge difference. Yeah. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say that.
Wow. Thank you so much, colleagues. This is just to say, Honorable Deputy Speaker, Mr. Lechesa, our honorable guests, speakers, and also our moderator, Zugi. Let's give her a hand. She did a great job. And you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out. We don't take this for granted. You would be busy with other things, but you joined in this very critical conversation on public budgets. So we here are representing the Imali Yethu Coalition and SAHTAC Coalition. We have put together our call to action because we just don't want to talk about these issues and let them be. We need concrete things that are actionable, that we think our decision makers and policy makers have the capacity to action on. So this is what we would like to see happening. We call for the government to provide platforms for meaningful participation for public, civil society in the budgeting process, including pre-budget public hearings that prioritize feedback mechanisms. Yes. Secondly, we call for access to reliable budget information to enable civil society to track and hold the government accountable for the budget, including the development of multi-stakeholder open platforms such as Vulekamali. We also call for proactive transparency and accountability in the government's budget processes. And then SAHTAC, that's us, we call for the South African government to increase its health R&D budget allocation to meet the 2% commitment of the national health budget for health R&D. And lastly, we are calling for the harnessing and strengthening of public-private partnerships to promote domestic resource mobilization. Thank you so much, colleagues. Yes. We are going to quickly ask all of us to come to the podium, to the platform here so we can take a group photo, and then from there we'll proceed to our lunch. Thank you so much, and put your hands together for yourselves. front so we can have a nice big group photo.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians?" Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The Malin Guardian, if you really want to know.